addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and video media online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.
We say fight back!
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Transgender Warriors, Making History from Joan of Arc to Marshall P. Johnson and Beyond by Leslie Feinberg. This is from the preface. Are you a guy or a girl? I've heard the question all my life. The answer is not so simple, since there are no pronouns in the English language as complex as I am, and I don't want to simplify myself in order to neatly fit one or the other. There are millions more like me in the United States alone. We have a history filled with militant heroes and heroines, yet therein lies the rub. How can I tell you about their battles when the words woman and man, feminine and masculine are almost the only words that exist in the English language to describe all the vicissitudes of bodies and styles of expression? Living struggles accelerate changes in language. I heard language evolve during the 1960s when I came out into the drag bars of Western New York and Southern Ontario. At that time, the only words used to describe us, cut and seared, yelled at us from the window of a screeching car filled with potential bashers. There were no words that we'd go out of our way to use that made us feel good about ourselves. When we all first heard the word gay, some of my friends vehemently opposed the word on the grounds that it made us sound happy. No one will ever use gay, my friends assured me, each offering an alternative word, none of which took root. I learned that language can't be ordered individually as if it's from a Sears catalog. It is forged collectively in the fiery heat of struggle. Right now, much of the sensitive language that was won by the liberation movement in the United States during the 60s and 70s is bearing the brunt of a right-wing backlash as being politically correct. Where I come from, being politically correct means using language that respects other people's oppressions and wounds. This chosen language needs to be defended. The words I use in this book may become outdated in a very short time because the transgender movement is still young and defining itself. But while the slogans lettered on the banners may change quickly, the struggle will rage on. Since I am writing this book as a contribution to the demand for transgender liberation, the language I'm using in this book is not aimed at defining, but at defending the diverse communities that are coalescing. I don't have a personal stake in whether the trans liberation movement results in a new third pronoun or gender-neutral pronouns like the ones such as Z, she or he, and here, her, his, being experimented with in cyberspace. It is not the words in and of themselves that are important to me, it's our lives. The struggle of trans people over the centuries is not a his story or her story, it's a our story. I've been called a he, she, butch, bulldagger, cross-dresser, passing woman, female to male transvestite, and drag king. The word I prefer to use to describe myself is transgender. Today, the word transgender has at least two colloquial meanings. It has been used as an umbrella term to include everyone who challenges the boundaries of sex and gender. It is also used to draw a distinction between those who reassign the sex they were labeled at birth and those of us whose gender expression is considered inappropriate for our sex. Presently, many organizations, from Transgender Nation in San Francisco to Monmouth Ocean Transgender on the Jersey Shore, use this term inclusively. I asked many self-identified transgender activists who are named or pictured in this book who they believed were included under the umbrella term. Those polled named transsexuals, transgender, transvestites, transgenderists, big enders, drag queens, drag kings, cross-dressers, masculine women, feminine men, intersexuals, people referred to in the past as hermaphrodites, androgynes, cross-genders, shapeshifters, passing women, passing men, gender benders, gender blenders, bearded women, and women bodybuilders who have crossed the line of what is considered socially acceptable for a female body. But the word transgender is increasingly being used in a more specific way as well. The term transgenderist was first introduced into the English language by trans warrior Virginia Prince. Prince told me, quote, "I coined the term transgenderist in 1987 or 88. There had to be some name for people like myself who trans the gender barrier, meaning somebody who lives full-time in the gender opposite to their anatomy. I have not transed the sex barrier," end quote. As the overall transgender movement has developed, more people are exploring this distinction between a person's sex, female, intersexual, male, and their gender expression, feminine, androgynous, masculine, and other variations. Many national and local gender magazines and community groups are starting to use TS/TG, transsexual and transgender. Under Western law, doctors glance at the genitals of an infant and pronounce the baby female or male, and that's that. Transsexual men and women traverse the boundary of the sex they were assigned at birth. And in dominant Western cultures, the gender expression of babies is assumed at birth. Pink for girls, blue for boys. Girls are expected to grow up feminine, boys masculine. Transgender people traverse, bridge, or blur the boundary of the gender expression that they were assigned at birth.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Hey, I'm back. Greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. Thom Hartmann here with you on this beautiful Monday, the week of Thanksgiving. Be a short week. We'll be here 3 days, and it's going to be a fascinating 3 days, no doubt. A lot to talk about today, and of course, you know, your calls throughout the day. Is Jack Smith a total badass? Give you a little background on the guy who's going to be looking into Donald Trump. The short answer to that question appears to be yes. I'll give you the details. And also, if you want to die young, take the red pill. I'll explain in just a moment. In our second hour, did the GOP take the House back due to court-backed gerrymandering? I've got a brief take on this, or a little bit of information, but we're going to do a much deeper dive on the whole topic in the third hour when David Daley is going to join us. He's got a piece in The Atlantic, what we learned from the midterms and what we can do about it. And also, why is the AARP boosting Medicare privatization? Well, I've mentioned this in passing, in previous shows. And, people have called and said, I'm an AARP member, and I think maybe I should get a Medicare Advantage program through them. It looks wonderful. And I've always said, they make their money that way. I'll give you the details on that in the second hour of the program. It's pretty shocking, actually. And also, an Arizona Republican has gone into hiding because of death threats. This is another incredible story. Fascism comes to America. Fascism and death threats always go hand in hand. Violence is the cardinal characteristic of fascism. And we certainly saw this in the nightclub in Colorado Springs, and our hearts go out to all the people whose lives were impacted by that, which is basically everybody in the United States who is LGBTQ or cares about anybody who is or cares about. I mean, this is such a terrible crime, and it's such a sad commentary on the state of hate talk in the United States. Lauren Boebert, who represents Colorado, has been out there ranting about gays and schools and grooming and all this, among others, right? I lay this right at the feet of the GOP. We'll probably do a longer segment on it tomorrow. I wanted to reach out to a couple of people who might have a more comprehensive perspective on this than I. But I just toss that out for conversation today. And also, the Republican Party is preparing to attack America with Santa Claus. Those of you who are longtime listeners of the program know about my obsession with Jude Wanniski. I will do a deep dive into that in the third hour of our program. But let's just get started out. Is Jack Smith a total badass? This guy who is going to be taking on Donald Trump. He has been a prosecutor over at The Hague, which is like no small thing in and of itself. I mean, in fact, it's a pretty major thing in and of itself. He's an obsessive triathlete. In fact, the reason he wasn't back for his appointment last week was because he's recovering from knee. Apparently, he's back in Washington, D.C. today. But he's been stationed in the Netherlands because he's trying war criminals. They're still going after people left over from the Milosevic and Radovan Karadzic era in Serbia. And this is a guy. This is a guy who takes no prisoners. He's a serious badass prosecutor. And he was the chief prosecutor for the war crimes committed by during the Kosovo War. He is fearless. He is tough. His track record reinforces this. He has successfully prosecuted here in the United States civil rights violations, the murders of police officers. He's led over 100 criminal prosecutions in the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York, addressing violent crimes, addressing white-collar crime, which, of course, and financial fraud, which is, of course, is what Donald Trump and his associates, his many associates, co-conspirators, collaborators, whatever you want to call them, have been charged with. He has prosecuted white-collar crime. Of course, that's Donald Trump. He has prosecuted public sector corruption. And, I mean, look up public sector corruption in the dictionary, and there's a picture of Donald Trump and his cabinet, right? He has supervised complex war crimes investigations at the International Criminal Court. I kind of started with that. And he was chief of the Public Integrity Section at the U.S. Justice Department for many years, which handles public corruption cases and cases involving members of Congress. So this guy is no shrinking violet. He is a serious, lifelong prosecutor. He's a young guy too. I believe he's in his late 40s, and I think that Donald Trump has a lot to be worried about here. I would be surprised if by spring Donald Trump has not been arrested and indicted. Now, unlike the typical criminal who commits the kinds of crimes that Donald Trump has been accused of, Reality Winner, for example, stole one classified document and spent 5 years in prison. And, they raided her home, they dragged her off in handcuffs, she never saw the light of day for another 5 years. They're not going to do that to Donald Trump because he's a billionaire and he's a former president, and we have a two-tier justice system in the United States, one for wealthy and powerful people and another for everybody else. Just like we have a two-tier medical system in the United States, one for the rich and one for everybody else. We have a two-tier credit system. We have a two-tier, you name it, right? But this is something that I think we should be taking very seriously, and I think that Trump needs to be taken seriously. Now, let me add, and this is, I don't see anybody talking about this, which surprises me. When Benjamin Netanyahu won his victory in Israel, I listen to a wide variety of podcasts, and I read a lot of different newspapers, including Haaretz, the only major progressive newspaper that's published in Israel, and occasionally a Jerusalem Post, which is sort of the conservative publication and nationwide newspaper in Israel. And the consensus seemed to be that Netanyahu, when he was defeated in the election before last, or maybe it was two before last, was politically toast, that he was politically dead. I mean, they were writing Netanyahu's political obituary the same way that they're writing Donald Trump's political obituary. From what I have read, the commentators that I have listened to and read, and friends of mine who live in Israel, my understanding, and again, if your understanding is different than this, or you know something I don't know, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this and what you think in general is going to be the impact of an arrest and prosecution of Donald Trump. But what I'm hearing is that Netanyahu really was politically toast. But his being prosecuted for corruption, Netanyahu's accused of taking bribes. The largest charges against him are still relatively minor crimes compared to what Donald Trump has been accused of. He's been accused of taking, cigars was the most minor thing, of taking, mostly gifts from rich people who are helping out his campaigns and who wanted things from him in the government that he gave to them. But he's been basically accused of taking bribes. Netanyahu's response to that was essentially, the Israeli deep state is out to get me. And there's a fairly broad, I won't say consensus, but a fairly broad opinion held among political commentators across Israel that it was the prosecution of Netanyahu that invigorated his followers and his base enough to show up and vote for his party and put him back into office in Israel. Now, if this is true, this very much falls into the be careful what you wish for category. And so, something that we should all be taking very seriously and thinking about is, if Donald Trump is prosecuted, will that actually revive his political prospects? I'm of the opinion that it will. I realize that the consensus or the conventional wisdom in America is that if he's prosecuted, he's politically toast, and that's really going to hurt him. I think it's the actual the other way around. And Israel, the politics of Israel are in many ways very similar to that of the United States. Here, it's immigration and black people and brown people. There, it's Palestinians and Arabs within the Israeli government, within the Knesset and things like that. But basically, race plays a huge role. And the right is largely all about race. Here, too.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Up next, you want to die young? Take the red pill. I'll tell you about that in just a moment. And welcome back. Trying to expand the size of my call screener. So here we go. All righty, let's pick up some of your phone calls here. Joan in Rochester, Minnesota. Hey, Joan, thanks for watching us on Free Speech TV. What's on your mind today?
Well, you were talking about, the LGBT and transvestites, and I would like to give a little message to young people or parents that have a child born with both sexes. I watched a TV show several years ago where I don't know if it was Dr. Phil or somebody like that, where they had some parents who brought their child in who didn't make the decision when the child was born. they let the child grow up and show either the male or female tendencies.
You're talking about
while they were
hermaphrodites,
young.
people who are literally
Yes,
born
I
with
am.
two sets. That's exceedingly
Yes,
rare, John.
But I know, but I had a friend who was leaving for the weekend to go back home, where their family was going to get together to try to work with the doctor to find out what sex they should make that child. And that child should have a chance to show by getting a little bit older. Women have females have traits and males have traits, and they show up at a pretty young age. And if they allow a child to grow a little and make the right decision, there would be a lot of people who wouldn't be in pain and hurting and had their lives misdirected all of these years and have suffered at the hands of other people. No, it's something that could be doable if the medical profession would diagnoses and tell the parents, give your child a little time.
What you're talking about, gender, is the difference between Joan, is the difference between physical gender and mental brain gender. And there obviously is a difference because we have so many trans people who were born, with male or female apparatus, and I'm not talking about hermaphrodites here, which are people who are born with both, and who, as they reach typically 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, it's the age at which most young people become gender aware, shall we say. They may not be sexually aware, but they're certainly gender aware. That's the contrast or the difference or the conflict between physical gender and brain gender or association. That's a completely different thing from hermaphroditism, if I'm using the word correctly. And there you'd have to wait years, and growing through those years with with your body producing basically two sets of hormones and I just, I have to trust the doctors on this one, Joan. And Joan, I'm gonna end the conversation there because I just, the whole, what do you do about hermaphroditism thing is, purely a medical issue. It's not. This is not a social issue. It's not something that's within our society. But clearly, people whose brains are wired in a way, and as I said, most young people basically know, am I a boy or a girl at a fairly young age, or am I straight or gay or bi or whatever. I think we just need to respect the way people's brains are wired, what they're declaring for themselves, and leave it at that. It's 20 minutes past the hour. We'll pick up your calls on the side of the break. Stick around. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. Why is it that every American voter doesn't know that when the baby formula factory had to shut down and Congress tried to appropriate $28 million to get baby formula to families all across America, 219 Democratic members of the House of Representatives voted for that, but only 12 Republicans did? Why doesn't every voter know that only 12 Republicans voted for baby formula? Why doesn't every American know that only 34 Republicans voted to protect veterans' benefits when 222 Democrats voted for it? Why doesn't every American know that only 12 Republicans in the House of Representatives voted to lower the cost of insulin? Why doesn't every American know that not one single Republican voted to hold oil and gas companies accountable when they're nakedly, obviously, clearly, illegally engaging in price fixing and price gouging? The Democratic Party needs to fine-tune its message. There's a whole video about this over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. That ad needs to be cut back. It's 22 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. All righty, I wanted to share with you this, I was doing a deep data dive yesterday afternoon. We got back from our anniversary vacation. By the way, and special thanks to Jefferson Smith, who did a marvelous job filling in for me all this last week. He's a great host. He's a good guy. And I'm so grateful to him, and that he was able to just walk in and take over the show and do such a great job. It's very what do you call it? Reassuring. I can leave and relax. But anyway, my op-ed today over at HartmanReport.com. Yes, all last week I was because Louise and I were on vacation. I was taking older pieces and just tweaking them slightly because I didn't even have a computer with me. I was doing everything on my phone, and so just tweaking them slightly and posting them Monday through Friday of last week. This week, of course, I'm writing brand new things from scratch. And today's article is titled, "If You Want to Die Young, Take the Red Pill." Now, it is based on some graphics. And if you want to see these, you pretty much have to go over to HartmanReport.com. I also posted it this morning at dailycoz.com, which is the other site where I normally post these things. And you can see the graphics at either one of those two places. But the first is from a Substack newsletter by Jeremy Ney. This one is, his Substack is called American Inequality, and I recommend it very highly. And his graph is titled Life Expectancy in America. And it's about average age of death. And the average age of death in most of your red states, not all of them, but certainly most of them, and large chunks of many of the rest of them, the average age of death is around 66.8 years. The average age of death in most of your blue states is 86.8 years. That's a 20-year gap just from living in a red state versus a blue state. Now, the second graph that I put up is United States life expectancy at birth. The previous one was at death. This one is at birth. So, in other words, how old do we expect young people to live? And, of course, this does not take into account climate change. And, again, same deal. What you find is that in the red states, average life expectancy runs around 75 years at birth. And in the blue states, average life expectancy is running as high as 81 years at birth. If you zoom out even further, there's an amazing graphic over at Our World in Data, which graphs life expectancy versus health expenditures. And it starts way back in 1970. And in 1970, the average life expectancy in the United States and all the other countries that they graphed, Israel, Spain, Italy, South Korea, Japan, Switzerland, Austria, France, Norway, Sweden, Ireland, Canada, New Zealand, Portugal, Finland, and the Netherlands, Austria, Belgium, UK, Germany, and Denmark, all of them, we were all around 71 years. That was average life expectancy. And we all spent an average of around $1,500 per person per year for health care. Now, life expectancy by 1980, the beginning of the Reagan Revolution, went up to 74 years for all these countries, including us. But then suddenly, in the 1980s, the Reagan Revolution took us off on a tangent, and our life expectancy plateaued out at around 78 years, whereas everybody else went up to 84 years, which is what it is in Switzerland, Japan, Spain, Italy, et cetera. 84 years. Also, their expenditures per person. In Israel, the average health expenditure per person is $2,500 a year. Here in the United States, it is now $10,000 per person per year. No other country in the world is higher than $7,000, which is Switzerland. No other country other than Switzerland is higher than $5,000 a year, which would be Norway, and Germany is around $4,500. But here in the United States, $10,000 a year, and we live 6 years shorter. This is insane. It's also GOP
You're
policy.
listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
27 minutes past the hour. I'll pick up your calls on the other side of the break. There's a lot on the table here to talk about. Stick around. For our book today, we're reading from Elon Papp's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. This is from the preface. It's titled The Red House. The Red House was a typical early Tel Avivian building, the pride of the Jewish builders and craftsmen who toiled over in the 1920s. It had been designed to house the head office of the local Workers' Council. It remained such until toward the end of 1947, it became the headquarters of the Haganah, the main Zionist underground militia in Palestine. Located near the sea on Yarkon Street in the northern part of Tel Aviv, the building formed another fine addition to the first Hebrew city in the Mediterranean, the White City, as its literati and pundits affectionately called it. For in those days, unlike today, the immaculate whiteness of his houses still bathed the town as a whole in the opulent brightness so typical of Mediterranean port cities of that era and that region. It was a sight for sore eyes, elegantly fusing Bauhaus motifs with native Palestinian architecture in an admixture that was called Levantine, in the least derogatory sense of the term. Such too was the Red House, its simple rectangular features graced with frontal arches that framed the entrance and supported the balconies of its two upper stories. It was either its association with the workers' movement that had inspired the adjective red, or its pinkish tinge that it acquired during sunset that had given the house its name. The former was more fitting, as the building continued to be associated with the Zionist version of socialism when, in the 1970s, it became the main office for Israel's kibbutzim movement. Houses like this, important historical remnants of the mandatory period, prompted UNESCO in 2003 to designate Tel Aviv as a World Heritage Site. Today, the house is no longer there, a victim of development, which has razed this architectural relic to the ground to make room for a car park next to the new Sheraton Hotel. Thus, in this street, too, no trace is left of the White City, which it has slowly transmogrified into the sprawling, polluted, extravagant metropolis that is the modern Tel Aviv. In this building on a cold Wednesday afternoon, 10 March 1948, a group of 11 men, veteran Zionist leaders, together with young military Jewish officers, put the final touches on a plan for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. That same evening, military orders were dispatched to the units on the ground to prepare for the systematic expulsion of Palestinians from vast areas of the country. The orders came from a detailed description of the methods to be employed to forcibly evict the people: large-scale intimidation, laying siege to and bombarding villages and population centers, setting fire to homes, properties, goods, expulsion, demolition, and finally planting mines among the rubble to prevent any of the expelled inhabitants from returning. Each unit was issued with its own list of villages and neighborhoods as the targets of the master plan. Codenamed Plan D, Dalet in Hebrew, this was the fourth and final version of less substantial plans that outlined the fate the Zionists had in store for Palestine and consequently for its native population. The previous three schemes had articulated only obscurely how the Zionist leadership contemplated dealing with the presence of so many Palestinians living in the land that the Jewish national movement coveted as its own. This fourth and last blueprint spelled it out clearly and unambiguously. Quote, "The Palestinians have to go," end quote. In the words of one of the first historians to note the significance of that plan, Simcha Flapan, the military campaign against the Arabs, including the conquest and destruction of the rural areas, was set forth in the Haganah's Plan Dalet. The aim for the plan was, in fact, the destruction of both the rural and urban areas of Palestine. As the first chapters of this book will attempt to show, this plan was both the inevitable product of the Zionist ideological impulse to have an exclusively Jewish presence in Palestine, and a response to developments on the ground once the British cabinet had decided to end the mandate. Clashes with local Palestinian militias provided the perfect context and pretext for implementing the ideological vision of an ethnically cleansed Palestine. The Zionist policy was first based on retaliation against Palestinian attacks in February of 1947, and it transformed into an initiative to ethnically cleanse the country as a whole in March of 1948. Once the decision was taken, it took 6 months to complete the mission. When it was over, more than half of Palestine's native population, close to 800,000 people, had been uprooted. 531 villages had been destroyed, and 11 urban neighborhoods had been emptied of their inhabitants. The plan decided upon on 10 March 1948, and above all its systematic implementation in the following months, was a clear-cut case of ethnic cleansing operation regarded under international law today as a crime against humanity. After the Holocaust, it has become impossible to conceal large-scale crimes against humanity. Our modern communication-driven world, especially since the upsurge of electronic media,
no longer allows human-made catastrophes to remain hidden from the public eye or to be denied. And yet one such crime has been erased almost totally from the global public memory: the disposition of the Palestinians in 1948 by Israel. This, the most formative element in the modern history of the land of Palestine, has ever since been systematically denied and is still today not recognized as an historical fact, let alone acknowledged as a crime that needs to be confronted politically as well as morally. Ethnic cleansing is a crime against humanity, and the people who perpetrate it today are considered criminals to be brought before special tribunals. It may be difficult to decide how one ought to refer to or deal with in the legal sphere those who initiated and perpetrated ethnic cleansing in Palestine in 1948, but it's impossible to reconstruct their crimes. Anyhow, it continues the ethnic cleansing of Palestine.
Our 1-hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3-hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Oh, one other topic. I'm going to get into this in the second hour. I'm going to pick up your phone calls now, but one other topic I wanted to point out to you is the growing movement across Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, in favor of basically Russia in the Ukraine war. And there's a fascinating piece about this in the Financial Times today. This is really growing in Germany, particularly in the old East Germany, which is the most conservative, like Leipzig, which is the most conservative part of Germany. We'll talk about that in the second hour, but just wanted to flag that for you. So picking up your phone calls, Dave in Federal Way, Washington. Hey, Dave, what's on your mind today?
Hey, not too much, Tom. I want to comment about this special prosecutor, Jack Smith.
Yeah.
And I've noticed that, all right, I use this term institutionalist. I mean, other people use the term, but a lot of people don't really know what that means, and I understand why they don't. Because you can be liberal and an institutionalist, or you can be conservative. But the bottom line is, it is very, very important what you said about this two-tier justice system we have. And this is more than just, well, it's unfair. Look, this is international, Tom. And let me tell you why this is going to lead to something really, really devastating.
I'd say Netanyahu's an example of that, too.
Well, and Trump, I don't know if you noticed, but Trump just got a big contract with Dar al-Arkan to build some very high...
Oh, he just got billions of dollars from the Saudis. I mean, he's totally in bed with the Saudis. In fact, you could argue that the Saudis are funding Trump's run for the presidency.
Yes, and again, someone might say, so what? He's monetized the presidency. Well, here's the so what, Tom. Pyongyang, North Korea, they just tested a Hwasong-17 ICBM that can hit any part of the United States. Right. All they have to do is miniaturize the warhead. Look, this is in North Korea. They do not recognize South Korea. Like, for instance, do you realize if Kim Jong-un himself converted to Christianity, he could not advocate for Christianity because Christianity is an imperialist novelty. It is something that was introduced to colonize South Korea. It is a foreign innovation. Now, if you look at China, you say, no, Dave, China's different than North Korea. Yes, but look at what Chairman Xi said to the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. He said Justin Trudeau tried to complain about Chinese interference in their elections, and Chairman Xi dismissed him out of hand, just like Donald Rumsfeld used to do. He basically gave him the side eye in vernacular, right? Like he was trying to pretend Justin Trudeau wasn't even there.
What's your point, Dave?
Well, the
you
point
seem all
is,
over the map this morning.
Well, no, let me narrow it down for you. This is more than just Ukraine. I'm glad you're talking about Ukraine, but Chinese and Russian forces outnumber, on the Arctic Circle, it's 5-1 right now. It's China and Russia on the Arctic Circle. They and that
that's true just of their landmass.
Right, and if you there's this comment, right, that people keep bringing up. Totalitarian regimes, they underestimate democracies, okay? But we are not behaving like a democracy with a two-tier justice system. Do you understand the break in communication?
I see.
And it's going to lead to possibly World War III. I know people don't like the World War III discussion.
Yeah, no, I get it.
I'm telling you, I am.
Dave, I get it. I want to wrap it up. Thank you very much for the call and your thoughts. Tyrone in Harlem, New York. Hey, Tyrone, what's on your mind today?
How you doing? And welcome back. I hope you had a nice little vacation and got a little rest.
We did.
Reprieve.
We had a great time.
That's a wonderful thing. That's a wonderful thing. I was thinking about the Attorney General putting up this special prosecutor, and I'm hoping that we as Democratic voters understand what we're up against, because I think it's the mindset of John Wilkes Booth and that Know Nothing Party that that killed Lincoln and plotted to kill his cabinet and all the rest of these people. That mindset is alive and well in some part of the Republican Party that is willing to do whatever it takes and kill and steal whatever they need to do to get in power.
Well, I don't know about killing, but they're certainly willing to encourage violence.
You see what happened at the Capitol.
You're true.
Somebody got killed there.
They killed 5 people and 3 cops.
Hello, so that's why I say willing to kill, and we don't want to accept the fact that there are a certain segment of the American population that is not willing to accept the premise of a United States of America.
Right.
They love America, but they don't love that united part, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to separate us from each other. And unless we have a fuller understanding and accept the fact that some of these people will never accept the fact that 2 men get married, or 2 women get married, or black and white get married. There are still people walking around here now that have that mindset, and they are in powerful positions. These are not, they say, oh, those only hillbillies that think that way. No, these are very professional. Some of them are in office. Some of them are running businesses that feel this way, and they're using this as a way to keep us from getting out of this hole that we're in. Because we're in a hole. We are so far behind as a so-called civilization that we can't even comprehend how far behind we are, because when they started this country, it was only about the 1%. It wasn't about women. It wasn't about poor whites. Definitely wasn't about the enslaved. It was about making sure that the rich stay rich. And
that's the biggest point, Tyrone, of this whole thing.
Yes.
Of around debating whether or not gay people should get married. The Supreme Court now, Clarence Thomas saying that he thinks they should reevaluate it. The Republicans would love us to be debating gay marriage again. The Republicans would love that, because it means that we would stop talking about them robbing us blind. Because that's their real agenda. Their real agenda is creating billionaires. It's creating wealth for giant corporations. It's robbing and ripping off the middle class and the average working person. It's destroying unions. It's keeping the minimum wage down. It's ending any kind of government programs that might lift up working class people or the poor, because those things have to be paid for by taxes, and the rich people don't want to pay their taxes. And as long as they can keep us talking about things like gay marriage, which is not to say we shouldn't be talking about it, but I'm saying this is one of the reasons why they love to talk about these issues and why they love to talk about critical race theory and all this other stuff, is because it refocuses the attention of America, particularly with regard to the Republican Party, away from the economic violence that they are doing on this country. And because there's so much violence directed against people of color and basically queer people, LGBTQ people, that they're very happy with that.
Yes, and what's actually keeping us the most, Malcolm X said, the most powerful industry in this world is the media. It makes an innocent man guilty and it makes a guilty man innocent, and they control what we think and how we feel about certain things. And because these people have been so good at what they do, we don't even realize that, okay, I don't look at the news, but I get information from somebody that look at the news. So I'm still getting the information from the people that, and we've been running around in circles, chasing our tail. And unless we recognize that the rich is they're dead set. That's why the wealth gap has widened. Because they say, listen, let me just get richer. I don't care what happens to the rest of these people. And they say there's not enough room for us. No, there's not enough room for poor people. That's the way it's not enough, because if you don't have money, you can't. That's why you got homelessness. Yeah. That's why you got sick people. That's why because there's not enough room for them people. It's enough room for millionaires and billionaires. Oh, there's enough room for them, but there's not enough room for your average citizen that can't afford to pay $2,000, $3,000 a month for rent.
Absolutely. Or anybody who wants to, flee persecution in some other country and come here to work or live. I'm with you. Tyrone, thank you. Is spot on. Pearson in Lamarck, Texas. Hey, Pearson, what's up?
Oh, I'm doing okay. It's cold and rainy down here, and in spite of the election, I'm still surrounded by Republicans.
Yeah, and probably always will be. What's on your mind today?
And in that vein, I will jump off on Tyrone. Was it Tyrone, the previous caller to me? I will jump off on Springborn on what he said and take issue with what you said earlier about Netanyahu, the situation in Israel, how that could replicate itself here in the United States. And I would remind you that the worst that you're warning us about is already in the process of happening, and it will continue if we don't do what we're supposed to do according to the majority, the silent majority, which will turn sour. You're talking about Democrats always poisoning the voting well? If we don't prosecute and find guilty and imprison Donald Trump and his crew, the people on the left, you're talking about big problems.
Oh, I'm not saying we shouldn't. I absolutely believe we should. I'm just saying that the unintended side effect of it may well be increasing his political popularity and reinvigorating his base, just like happened with Netanyahu in Israel.
Well, I'll tell you what, what we need to invigorate? We need to invigorate the actual people who work for a living every day, not just those on the right, because libs work too, we have guns too, and we are righteous, not self-righteous like the other guys. So I'm glad to hear that you agree that we need to do the job of prosecuting Donald Trump, because that is the just and right thing to do. That will heal America. Yeah, I
totally get it. I'm with you. Pearson, thank you very much. Michael in Bronx, New York. Hey, Michael, what's up?
Hi, Tom. How you doing?
Good. What's on your mind?
Ever since Trump announced his re-election bid, I don't know if you noticed this, but there's been a big increase in violent crimes, attacks, biased, hateful attacks towards LGBTQs, towards people of color, and pretty much any and everybody that is not a MAGA Trump supporter. And who are the perpetrators? The MAGA Trump supporters, those who are following Trump. So the whole thing is that where's the connection to all this? I'll tell you this. Trump is on notice saying if he wins re-election, he will pardon every single insurrectionist from January 6th, and knowing his track record, he'll pardon anyone and everyone that commits violence in his name.
You're right.
So following the previous caller, yes, Donald Trump should have been long indicted, prosecuted, and convicted. I'm kind of glad that, what's his name, Merrick Garland finally naming an independent counsel at least, although he should have taken the matter off himself. But I do understand the prospects of President Biden running for re-election right now. If it's a Biden versus Trump part 2, I understand Garland is trying to avoid any kind of conflict of interest. But again, this is something that's long overdue and needs to be stopped before it goes any further.
Well, the other thing is that by appointing a special prosecutor, keep in mind, John Durham still has his job. By appointing a special prosecutor, this guy can continue doing his work even if, God forbid, Donald Trump becomes president in 2 years. I mean, if he's going to do a deep dive and he's going to go after dozens and dozens of cronies of Trump's, this could last for a long, long time. Michael, I got to run, but thank you.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
47 minutes past the hour. Back with more of your calls in just a moment. And welcome back, Paul in Ambler, Pennsylvania. Hey, Paul, thanks for listening on the Thom Hartmann app. What's up?
Hi, glad to have you back, Tom.
Thank
and
you.
I'm glad you had a nice, restful celebration. You were talking earlier about the immense amount of money that we spend on health care and life expectancy, the connection between it. You'd think if you spend as much as we do, we would live as long as Methuselah, which doesn't quite seem to be the case.
Right.
I'd like to point out something that I've seen because I go over a lot of the COVID health information on a regular basis just to stay up to date. And it turned out that during the COVID pandemic for the last, I think, 2020, they saw a doubling of something that we thought we had pretty much relegated to the past. It's the maternal mortality rate. We hear infant mortality rate, like so many infants die per 100,000. Right. But the maternal mortality rate is something we don't talk about because it's been driven down to next to nothing.
Now, are you talking about women who are dying during pregnancy and in childbirth as a consequence of having COVID, or
no, just
unrelated to
I don't
COVID?
know if they got. I don't know if they had COVID. I don't know if they had pneumonia. But the point is, you shouldn't have a doubling of a death rate among any cohort simply because they're in that group.
The U.S. average mortality rate actually dropped by about a year as a consequence of Donald Trump's mishandling of the COVID pandemic during 2020.
Right. But here's the other thing, and this leads to a larger issue: maternal mortality. Over 100 years ago, 1 in 100, or even 1 in 50 women died just because they were pregnant. If you got pregnant, I'm not saying it was a death sentence, but everyone knew somebody who died giving birth. Right. It was a perilous journey. One of the greatest successes of healthcare is public healthcare, which has driven it down to, in so many countries, below 10 per 100,000. Right. Now, here's the main thing. Other countries, for example, France, their idea of healthcare isn't just going to doctors and getting a CAT scan or an X-ray. Women who are pregnant get for a full year, from my understanding, watching France 24, the equivalent of a personal assistant. For a year, a woman who's pregnant has someone to help her through the day. And, I've never had a baby, but my wife has 3 times, and I had to live through it. And, people get knocked back on their heels. They're not able to do everything that they used to do.
Yep.
So having someone just to cook, clean, do the laundry, take you to an appointment. I can't always just walk out of work. Not everyone has a job as a lawyer or, film director or whatever. You can just walk out. Some people, if they leave their job, they get their pay docked. So you got to have somebody there for the woman. Well, in France, instead of investing in all kinds of ridiculous gadgets for women, someone who's there for them for a whole year as they go through the pregnancy.
Right.
And you get tremendous results, which is the reduction of maternal mortality.
Right.
So that's what I was saying. It isn't just spending a whole lot of money on pills and doctors and hospital stays. Something as simple as having a social relationship.
Maternal mortality in the southern states, I don't know if it's right across the board. I certainly know it's true of Mississippi and Alabama. Maternal mortality in those states and morbidity is at third world status. It is literally lower than any other developed country in the world. And it's one of the things that's skewing American statistics so badly. Paul, thank you for the call. Hey, I have a new book out. It's called The Hidden History of Neoliberalism, How Reaganism Gutted America and How to Restore Its Greatness. Greg Palast calls it a hand grenade of a book. You can pick it up wherever fine books are available. Tag you're it. Slavery was on the ballot in this last election we just had in 4 states. Seriously, I'll bet you thought slavery was over, right? The slavery ended with the 13th Amendment. Well, the 13th Amendment doesn't actually end slavery. It ends slavery for people who've never been convicted of a crime. But anybody who has been convicted of a crime is still vulnerable to slavery because the 13th Amendment has this exception that says you may be enslaved by the state if you are convicted of a crime. So in Oregon, Alabama, Tennessee, and Vermont, activists in each one of those states did the hard work to get these things, ballot initiatives, on the ballot to end slavery in those 4 states in this last election that we just had. And in all 4 states, they were passed. And that is really, really good. Now we need federal action. Senator Jeff Merkley is calling for federal action. There's a video about it over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. Welcome back. Picking up your calls. Devin in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Hey, Devin, what's on your mind today?
Well, hi, Tom. What's on my mind is how quickly we forget that the Saudis cut oil production and had absolutely no consequence from America. So there is no Democrat, there is no Republican, no one is talking about banning arms sales. All the contracts that are in process currently and any contract to come needs to be stopped right now, dead in the water. And I tell you why nobody is talking about it is because we have a filthy relationship with the Saudis that's all about money. And the company that runs American ammunition plants, BAE Systems, yeah, still ringing that bell, BAE Systems has a Saudi Arabian outlet, like they do production in Saudi Arabia. And there are plants in America that are making money. They're run by BAE Systems under this government go cooperation, and they're making money off the Saudi contracts. And that's why nobody, not Tim Kaine, not Mark Warner, not any, well, maybe Bernie, but, you know, no one is talking about banning arms sales to the Saudis because of the money.
Yeah.
And it's just disgusting.
Yeah, Ro Khanna has been all over it, by the way, Devin. He has, he's talked about that multiple times on this program. I think one of the, for the so-called policy realists, foreign policy realists, I put that in scare quotes, what they're looking at is the fact that Saudi Arabia is mind-bogglingly rich, extraordinarily powerful. They're kind of the linchpin for power in the Middle East. And if we were to lose them to Russia as an ally, which is sort of what looks like has been kind of slow motion happening. But if it were to really fully change that power relationship in the Middle East, it could be extraordinarily destabilizing, not just for the Middle East, but for the entire planet. That's not to say that I'm in favor of our continuing arms sales to the Saudis. I think I'm with you. I think we should cut them off and say, okay, you guys have to make a choice. Are you with us or are you with Putin? Are you with, which side are you on? But it is, and probably the best book on this is the one that Medea Benjamin wrote about the Saudis. She's been on the program a couple times about it. I'm sorry I don't have the topic or the title right off the top of my head.
Kingdom of something. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. But it all comes down to money. I mean, the Saudis have already shown us whose side they're on. They've already given us the big middle finger when they cut oil production. They gave us the big middle finger back in 2001, when they bombed the freaking Twin Towers. 19 or 17 of the bombers were from Saudi Arabia. I mean, how many times do we have to be kicked when we're down? Right. Let's stop selling arms to the bloody Saudi kingdom, period, end. And if everyone would just call their Congress people, you can get a hold of your congressperson and both of your senators by calling 202-224-3121 and ask them, why are they not calling for a ban on arms sales to Saudi Arabia right now, today? Yeah, Medea Benjamin's book, by the way, is titled Kingdom of the Unjust. And she lays it out. And for some reason, we talk about Saudi Arabia as if they're just like a normal country. It's a kingdom. I mean, it's literally a royal hierarchy that goes back a couple hundred years. And the country is run of, by, and for the royal family. And women have few rights. Gay people are actively persecuted. People who are not of Saudi lineage are in trouble, but even poor Saudis. To the extent that there still are poor Saudis, and there are, it's a tough place. Devin, thank you so much for the call. We're in the break, Sean, I think. There we go. We'll be back in the second hour here of the program. I want to get into what this pro-Russian protest movement that's sweeping East Germany. What does AARP say about Medicare privatization and gerrymandering in the Republican Party and the House?
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.
We say fight back!
Today is Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism and Other Arguments for Economic Independence by Kristen Godsey. And this is from the introduction titled, You Might Be Suffering from Capitalism. The argument of this book can be summed up succinctly. Unregulated capitalism is bad for women. And if we adopt some ideas from socialism, women will have better lives. If done properly, socialism leads to economic independence, better labor conditions, better work-family balance, and yes, even better sex. Finding a way into a better future requires learning from the mistakes of the past, including a thoughtful assessment of the history of 20th century state socialism in Eastern Europe. That's it. If you like the idea of such outcomes, then come along for an exploration of how we might change things. If you're dubious because you don't understand why capitalism as an economic system is uniquely bad for women, and if you doubt that there could ever be anything good about socialism, this short treatise will provide some illumination. If you don't give a whit about women's lives because you're a gynophobic right-wing internet troll, save your money and go back to your parents' basement right now. This isn't the book for you. Of course, some might argue that unregulated capitalism sucks for almost everyone, but I want to focus on how capitalism disproportionately harms women. Competitive labor markets discriminate against those whose reproductive biology makes them primarily responsible for childbearing. Today, this means humans who get pink hats in the hospital and the letter F next to the name on their birth certificate, as if we've already failed by not coming into the world as a boy. Competitive labor markets also devalue those expected to be the primary caregivers of children. Although societal attitudes have evolved in this regard, our idealization of motherhood means that most of us still believe that baby needs mama, a whole lot more than papa, at least until the child is old enough to play sports. Others will argue that unregulated capitalism is not bad for all women. Yes, for those women lucky enough to sit at the top of the income distribution, the system works pretty well. Although women at the executive level still face gender pay gaps and remain underrepresented in leadership positions, on the whole, things aren't too shabby for the Sheryl Sandbergs of the world. Of course, sexual harassment still hinders progress, even for those at the top, and too many women believe that if you want to run with the big dogs, you may have to suck it up and ignore the groping and unwanted advances. And race plays an important role as well. White women do a lot better in aggregate than do women of color. But when we look at society as a whole, on average, women are comparatively worse off in countries where markets are less encumbered by regulation, taxation, and public enterprises than they are in nations where state revenues support greater levels of redistribution and larger social safety nets. Choose your data source, and you find the same story. Unemployment and poverty plague women with children. Employers discriminate against women without children because they might have them in the future. In the United States in 2013, women over the age of 65 suffered from poverty at much greater rates than men and dominated those in the category of extreme poverty. Globally, women face higher rates of economic deprivation. Women are often the last to be hired and the first to be fired in cyclical downturns. And when they do find employment, bosses pay them less than men. When states need to slash government spending on education, health care, or old age pensions, mothers, daughters, sisters, and wives must pick up the slack, diverting their energy to care for the young, the sick, and the elderly. Capitalism thrives on women's unpaid labor in the home because women's care work supports lower taxes. Lower taxes mean higher profits for those already at the top of the income ladder, mostly men. But capitalism was not always so savage. Throughout much of the 20th century, state socialism presented an existential challenge to the worst excesses of the free market. The threat posed by Marxist ideologies forced Western governments to expand social safety nets to protect workers from the unpredictable but inevitable booms and busts of the capitalist economy. After the Berlin Wall fell, many celebrated the triumph of the West, consigning socialist ideas to the dustbin of history. But for all its faults, state socialism provided an important foil for capitalism. It was in response to a global discourse of social and economic rights, a discourse that appealed not only to the progressive populations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, but also to many men and women in Europe and Western Europe and North America, that politicians agreed to improve working conditions for wage laborers, as well as to create social programs for children, the poor, the elderly, the sick, and the disabled, mitigating exploitation and the growth of income inequality. Although there were important antecedents in the 1980s, once state socialism collapsed, capitalism shook off the constraints of market regulation and income redistribution. Without the looming threat of a rival superpower, the last 30 years of global neoliberalism have witnessed a rapid shriveling of social programs that protect citizens from cyclical instability and financial crises, and reduce the vast inequality of economic outcomes between those at the top and those at the bottom of the income distribution. For much of the 20th century, Western capitalist countries also endeavored to outdo the East European countries in terms of women's rights, fueling progressive social change. For example, the state socialists in the USSR and Eastern Europe were so successful at giving women economic opportunities outside the home that initially, for the 2 decades after the end of World War II, women's wage work was conflated with the evils of communism. The American way of life meant male breadwinners and female homemakers. But slowly, socialist championing of women's emancipation began to chip away at the Leave It to Beaver ideal. The Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957 spurred American leaders to rethink the costs of maintaining traditional gender roles. They feared the state socialists enjoyed an advantage in technological development, and why women have better sex under socialism.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to the second hour of our program. The gerrymandering of individual red states is literally the only reason why Republicans will control the House of Representatives in January. And the reason why that gerrymandering was allowed, essentially, or was so successful, was because of the Supreme Court. And this is something that, we're not talking about enough, frankly, and Democrats need to be taking very, very seriously. In fact, Democrats have been moving to un-gerrymander states. California is a great example. But there are a number of states, trying to get these electoral commissions so that the state maps are actually fair and Republicans have a chance to. We did the same thing here in Oregon. And one of our congressional districts that have been represented by a Democrat is now represented by a Republican. Because we're not gerrymandering here. We're doing it, in a way that's, relatively speaking, anyway, fair. I mean, I would argue that the involvement of some right-wing billionaires had a lot to do with why that particular seat went red, but nonetheless, in Rucho v. Common Cause, in 2019, the Supreme Court said that partisan gerrymandering is just fine. You can't do racial gerrymandering but you can do partisan gerrymandering. And oddly enough, black people tend to vote Democratic, over 90%. And so if you just do partisan gerrymandering, ta-da, you've done racial gerrymandering. And of course, you know, again, this was one of those decisions where all the Republicans on the court voted in favor of gerrymandering, and all the Democrats on the court said, no, that's not fair. People should be picking their representatives. Representatives should not be picking their people, their voters. And then there was, the case out of Alabama, a redistricting case. This was the Supreme Court's Merrill v. Milligan case that literally suspended the Voting Rights Act ban on racial gerrymandering. And as a result of that, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas were able to draw maps diminishing black power. Now, again, they said this isn't a racial gerrymander. This is, well, we're trying to be colorblind now. So yeah, it was a racial gerrymander. And this was in 2022. This was in February of this year. And as a result of that, you have 4 states that are overrepresented in Congress by Republicans and underrepresented by Democrats. In fact, the number of congressional seats that were lost to Democrats this year simply because of gerrymandering in a handful of states, in 6 or 8 Republican states, is 10, at least. 10 seats the Democrats would hold if it wasn't for gerrymandering. In Florida, just in Florida, Ron DeSantis came up with a more gerrymandered map than his own legislature proposed. And as a result of that, Florida now has 4 more Republican representatives than they did before, or than they would have, and just because of gerrymandering in Florida. And this went to the Florida Supreme Court in June of this year, and the Florida Supreme Court said, hey, we're with DeSantis. We're not going to call that unconstitutional. So we're good with that. In Florida's congressional delegation, if there was no gerrymandering in Florida, there would be 16 Republicans and 11 Democrats. But because of gerrymandering in Florida, there are 20 Republicans and 8 Democrats representing the state of Florida in Washington, D.C. Very, very straightforward stuff. We're going to do a deeper dive on this almost exactly an hour from now, so I'm just going to pause that right there. I also wanted to share with you this story that I read in the Financial Times this morning by Raphael Minder and Sam Jones. It's titled, Ordinary Germans Are Paying, and that's in scare quotes, anti-war protests stretch across Central Europe. And here's the thing, they note, the article starts out saying, were it not for the banners, it could have been a crowd gathering for an early opening of the Christmas market in Leipzig. But then came the speeches. And here are some quotes from the speeches. Germany is serving as a puppet exclusively for American interests and those of NATO. This is what the first person said. People were carrying banners for the German left, some peace flags, homemade signs, the German right. But this was all, mostly anti-American rhetoric. One speaker said, the embargo policy against Russia has failed completely and is being directed catastrophically against ourselves. And they are seeing a massive increase in the cost of heat. Heat and electricity in Germany as the result of saying, no, we're not going to buy any more German gas. Now, this isn't just happening in Germany. This is happening across Central and Eastern Europe. And as the Financial Times says, they point to a worrying trend for the region's political mainstream. In Slovakia, for example, polls show that 19% of the population want the Russians to win the war in Ukraine. 19%. In Austria, they've got this party, this neo-Nazi party, the Freedom Party. Nazis love to use the word freedom, right? It's called the Freedom Party. And again, a quote from the Financial Times, they have relentlessly blamed sanctions and hostility to Russia for the mounting economic hardship facing working-class Austrians. So, yeah, embrace some neoliberal policies, some tough times, and then blame it on the Ukrainians. We are entering, and I'm just, one of the things that I really try to do with this program is let you know what I see coming on the horizon. I'm not always right, but I'm usually right. And it's not any particular brilliance on my part. It's that I spend a lot of time informing myself about these things. It's what I do for a living. But what I'm seeing coming on the horizon is, number one, a real political crisis in Ukraine for the Zelensky government, as city after city goes dark and people are literally freezing to death. This is going to be very, very hard on them. This Russian strategy of doing to them what they did to Aleppo in Syria. Aleppo was, the uprising in Syria began in Damascus, when all these farmers from the northern crescent, as it were, the northern ridge of Syria, which was a wheat-growing area, as climate change moved the desert about 100 miles south, literally hundreds of thousands of small subsistence farmers, and even some of the larger farms, got wiped out. Their wells ran dry, and then their soil turned to sand, and so they ended up in the streets of Aleppo and Damascus. And when they got there, they were broke. They were living in the streets. They were poor. These were people who had been, middle-class farmers. And so they started demanding that the government, at the very least, provide them with housing or provide them with food or, come up with some jobs for them. And Bashar al-Assad's response, the dictator of Syria, his response was to machine gun them down in the streets. You may recall that this was like, 5 years ago? 4 or 5 years ago? And Russia, of course, has their one deep water port in that region is in Syria. And so, protecting their interests in Syria, they came in, and what did they do in Aleppo? Well, first, they took out the utilities. They just bombed the crap out of the utilities. Now, there they didn't have to worry about winter. It was more summer, and then the heat killing people. But then pretty soon people started dying of dysentery because the water treatment plants were gone. The septic treatment plants were gone. There was a mass death of children in Aleppo. And then the Russians started bombing the actual residential areas, the city itself. And they basically flattened the city. And this is what they're doing now in Ukraine. It's also what they did, in the breakaway regions of Russia back, 30 years ago, 25 years ago. I mean, this has been a Putin strategy for a long time. It's genocidal, but it's fine with him. So number one, there's going to be a crisis, a political crisis, I believe, that Ukraine is going to be facing coming up as winter really starts to bite. And, the conventional wisdom is that this is going to harden their spines, like it did the Brits when the bombing, when the Blitz was happening. But Britain wasn't reduced to rubble. There was still electricity. There was the bombing by the Germans in World War II was not strategic. It was just massive. And so, I'm not sure that great resolve. I think at a certain point, when your children are dying, when your family's dying, when the people around you are dying, at a certain point, people just get ready to say enough. But the larger threat, that's more of that's a softer threat. The harder threat is going to be in Europe this winter, and probably February, March, as the gas supplies start to run out, as the power plants are strained, as fuel prices continue to rise. Keep in mind, the inflation, our inflation is going down. Inflation is largely under control now in the United States, or at least all the trends are moving in that direction. That is not the case in Europe. And it's almost entirely because of fuel prices. And now you've got the Saudis working with the Russians on this to screw the Europeans. The United States is energy independent. If we just stopped exporting oil, and refined gasoline and things, largely to Brazil, by the way. If we just stopped, it's something that, started during the Trump administration in order to help out Bolsonaro. If we just stopped doing that, we could have all the energy we need for ourselves. But that's very much not the case in Europe. Europe is very dependent upon imports of energy. And so this is going to get tough. And I'm expecting what we're seeing right now most visibly in Germany and in Austria, is going to increase. And the biggest variable here, and I was surprised there wasn't a single paragraph about it in this Financial Times article, although I predict you will see more and more of this in the coming months, is that the Russian bots and troll farms are going to be in German, on Twitter and Facebook speaking to Germans, in Slovakian speaking to Slovakians, and Slovenian speaking to Slovenians, if I'm getting these languages right, in Czech to the Czechs, in France to the French, in Swedish to the Swedes. They're going to be, just like in 2016 during our election, we had, huge number, hundreds of thousands of these bots and trolls pretending to be Americans talking about how wonderful Donald Trump was. You're going to see the same thing in Europe. Not about Trump, but against Russia, against
the Thom
Ukraine.
Hartmann Program.
And that's going to be a real challenge for those governments, for these democratic governments in Europe, when social media gets weaponized, and it is right now, by the Russians against them. And welcome back. Picking up your phone calls here. Let's see, Kenyatta in Los Angeles. Hey, Kenyatta, what's on your mind today?
Well, what's on my mind is to say welcome back to you. I have missed you very much on the air.
Thank you.
You've become a kind of a drug for me in the last 6 years.
Well, we did, as I recall, talk at least once in email.
Yeah, well,
it's always nice to hear from you.
That's our business. Anyways, Listen, I'm going to try to be as succinct as I can, Tom. I have been listening to your, what I'm assuming is mostly European-American liberal audience, whom I love, and they've been very supportive of me, many of them, in my writings and such, and thanks to you. But
over at opednews.com, by the way.
Thank you, sir. I wanted to say to you, though, you had spoken at the beginning of the show. You talked about, and when we spoke last month, the last time we spoke, you had done a wonderful program on fascism, and we spoke, and I was telling you about, well, for black people, the United States has always been somewhat fascist, and of course you concurred. And I want to, Tom, I've been involved with the U.S. justice system in every possible facet, from the enforcement to being in it to you name it.
Yeah.
And I'm going to tell you something. I somewhat am glad to hear a segment of the society, the majority, recognize that there is a two-tier justice system. You had said, I think, I'm paraphrasing, but there's one for the rich people and one for the rest of us.
All right, rich and powerful.
However, for black people in this country, it's always been a two-tiered system. So now we've got really a three-tiered system. And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Right now, there's a man who is walking the streets of America who shot a sitting president by the name of Ronald Reagan. That man is named John Hinckley Jr. If John Hinckley Jr. had been and John Hinckley Jr. came from wealth, if he had been a poor white man, he probably would have gotten life in prison. If he had been a black man, he would be dust. When we talk about, and you've done a number of very informative programs on, in fact, you just talked about the gerrymandering, it's always the black vote, not people's color vote. There's not the Asian vote that's being suppressed and gerrymandered. It's not the Native American vote. It's not the Hispanic vote or the Latino vote. It's always the black vote. And so and I just wanted to give your listeners a bit of a bit of a sober sanity check. We've always lived with a two-tiered system. Yeah. And so look at Kyle Rittenhouse. Now, this is a dirt poor white boy. Dirt poor. He manages to come up with $2 million bail and get away with killing people. Do you think that had he looked like me, he could do that?
Yeah. He was just invited to some big Republican event, too, last week.
Tom, you and I have had this conversation unofficially. Let me tell you something. That dude's going to be in politics sooner or later. Watch what I tell you.
I think you're right. Amazing. Well, well said, Kenyatta, as always. Thank you so much for the call. It's great to hear from you.
Yes, sir.
We'll be right back. It's 22 minutes past the hour. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. So Republicans all over the country are all hysterical about all the money that we're spending on welfare. You know, we just can't afford this stuff. And so, you know, let's look at it. How much money are we spending on welfare? Well, it turns out the average American taxpayer making $50,000 a year, which is actually a little above the average, but the average American taxpayer making $50,000 a year, out of that $50,000, $36 goes toward food stamps and $6 towards other safety net programs. But that average American taxpayer making $50,000 a year, $870 of their taxes goes to pay for corporate subsidies. $1,600 goes to offset corporate tax loopholes. $1,231 goes to offset losses from corporate overseas tax havens. And don't get me started on the tax loopholes that let billionaires only pay 3% income taxes. There's a whole video about this over at thomhartmann.com if you want to do a deep dive. Check it out. Welcome back. Picking up your calls here. Mark in Portland. Hey, Mark, what's up?
Hey, in reference to what you were talking about, that Jack Smith is now prosecuting or will be acting as special counsel. I'm thinking that, you know, a way for him, I mean, espionage to me is one of the biggest laws that I think Trump has broken. If he can prove that does a couple things. It'll prevent Trump from running for office again legally. He cannot run for office. And B, it's got a pretty lengthy prison sentence if he's indicted and prosecuted. And I think those would be, among other crimes, I mean, I think that would be a significant blow to Trump and his followers if he cannot run for office again. What do you think?
I think you're right, Mark. Broadly speaking, I would be surprised, however, if any prosecution happens within the next 2 years. Excuse me. I think a prosecution is going to initiate within the next 6 months, but I'd be surprised if there's well, you know, actually, if they can't have a trial by the end of next year. Here's what I was thinking. It's like, you know, Netanyahu has been under indictment for years, right, in Israel. I keep going back to that because I think the analogy is a ripe one. You know, a lot of these guys are successful. The Attorney General for Texas, Ken Paxton, he's been under indictment for securities fraud for 7 years now, and he's still the Attorney General. And he just keeps delaying and delaying and delaying and getting new venues and finding new evidence and coming up with new, you know, quack, quack, quack. So if Trump is not successfully prosecuted by the time the next election happens, 2024, and if a Republican takes office, I'm betting that Republican is going to pull a Jerry Ford and pardon Trump.
Well, I'm wondering also, I mean, if someone's arrested for something, they're awaiting trial, but then shouldn't there be certain things they cannot be eligible for,
no.
Such as possible?
No, because we presume innocence until proven guilt.
I see, right. Okay. Well,
I mean, I realize, you know, I'm talking about Donald Trump here. I realize, you know, how naive or insane or whatever that sounds, but even Donald Trump is entitled to the presumption of innocence even when he commits his crimes right out in front of all of us. There's still, you know, we still have to have due process in the United States, and we need to be an example of that for the world.
I mean, we know that the Rosenbergs were executed for espionage and selling secrets.
And you know who made that happen? It was Donald Trump's lawyer. Oh, damn.
Roy Cohn.
Yeah, Roy Cohn. Thank you. Yeah, it was Roy Cohn. He was the guy who pushed that execution of those guys. He pushed it relentlessly. Mark, I got to run, but thank you for the call. And I don't think that there's a Roy Cohn around right now with regard to Donald Trump. We'll see. You know, time will tell. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
On the other side of the break, I have to tell you about AARP and Medicare Advantage, and I will be picking up your phone calls. Stick around. Today, we're reading about Thunderdome politics, an uncivil war taking back our democracy in an age of Trumpian disinformation and Thunderdome politics by Greg Sargent, the Washington Post columnist. This is from his chapter on voter suppression. It's page 37. Republicans and Democrats inhabit different political realities, as mentioned in a previous chapter. But there are certain facts about our politics that are just objectively true. One of them is this. Generally speaking, efforts to make it harder to vote are almost always pushed by Republicans. You cannot understand what is happening in American politics right now without recognizing this stark and very fundamental difference between the two major political parties. During this decade, procedural hurdles were put into place in around 20 states that in some manner or other have made it harder to vote or to register to vote, or have undone previous efforts to make voting or registering easier, or have otherwise threatened serious disenfranchisement. Most of them were the creation of Republican lawmakers and officials. The difference in the two parties' national platforms for 2016 tells the story. The GOP platform champions additional hurdles that are absurdly disproportionate to the phantom abuse it alleges, while the Democratic platform champions multiple specific ways to make it easier to vote, not harder. The most common and controversial of methods used by Republicans to suppress Democratic turnout is the requirement that would-be voters present identification at the polls. The game here tends to turn on requiring forms of ID that some groups are less likely to have, making participation harder for them. Other restrictions include techniques like cutting back on early voting and making it harder to register, both of which have, in recent years, been instituted in multiple states. Republicans who have passed laws making it harder to vote have tended to claim such measures are necessary to protect against, quote, voter fraud. We'll look at this in more detail below, but for now, note that most of the states that have passed such measures did so while under Republican control. As New York University political scientist Samuel Isikoff has memorably put it, the single predictor necessary to determine whether a state will impose voter access restrictions is whether Republicans control the ballot access process. Scholars trace the modern era of warfare over election rules to the intensely contested presidential election of 2000. In which a divided Supreme Court halted the recount in Florida, throwing the presidency to George W. Bush. The closeness and partisan acrimony of that contest, combined with the intense national focus on election rules that accompanied the court battle over it, helped persuade both parties to invest much more attention and energy on those rules. As a result, both the implementation of measures restricting the ballot and the legal battles over them have intensified in recent years. A brief glance at the surprising history of voter ID laws begins to tell the story of this tightening. In the 1970s, several states implemented voter ID measures, but all of them provided for ways that voters without the proper ID could cast a ballot. By 2000, there were 14 such laws, and they had been implemented by politicians in both parties. But by the mid-2000s, amid rising post-2000 acrimony, a handful of red states began implementing voter ID laws that the nonpartisan National Conference of State Legislatures described as, quote, strict, meaning that they make it easy to disqualify those who don't pass muster. After one of those laws in Indiana was challenged and then upheld in 2008 by the Supreme Court, an escalation began that gained momentum in the Obama era. From 2010 onward, the adoption of voter ID laws in general and of strict ones in particular accelerated. Though a handful were blocked in the courts, as of this writing, a total of 34 states have voter ID laws in effect, 24 that are deemed non-strict and 10 that are deemed strict. The strict ones are in red states or in swing states where they were implemented by Republicans. The story is very similar if you evaluate the state's voting rules in a broader way, by including not just voter ID measures, but also cutbacks to early voting and restrictions on registration. Here the trend is just as pronounced. After the 2010 elections, the Brennan Center for Justice documented a sharp rise in efforts to pass such measures in state legislatures across the country. Not all these efforts bore fruit, but many did. By the time voting took place in Election Day 2016, some 14 states had these new restrictions in place,
for the first time in a presidential election. Now, as of this writing, by the Brenner Center's count, some 20 states have successfully implemented either strict voting ID requirements or cutbacks to early voting or restrictions on registration or other measures with meaningful disenfranchising effects. If you're a liberal who's frustrated by the seemingly unbreakable Republican dominance of national politics, not to mention GOP control of most state governments across the country, then the chances are that these restrictions figure heavily into your explanation of this GOP supremacy. Indeed, social media has been absolutely saturated in recent years with variations of the lament that Republican political dominance is largely maintained through a combination of nefarious and undemocratic tactics, such as ballot restrictions that keep constituencies unfriendly to the GOP from voting, and extreme gerrymanders that have, in effect, built a fortress around the GOP's majority in the House of Representatives. Democrats frequently invoke the GOP's use of these tactics, often justifiably, to raise money and to galvanize turnout. This narrative contains some important truths. Some of the forms that these restrictions on voting access have taken in recent years are diabolically obvious in their efforts to keep constituencies supportive of Democrats from voting. Still others boast the distinction of being more insidiously designed and thus less obvious in their intentions. The book is An Uncivil War by Greg Sargent of the Washington Post.
Hey, thanks so much for sharing our program and for reaching out to our stations and sponsors and letting them know that you're listening. It really means a lot to us. Joe Biden has done a lot. He signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law. He announced targeted student debt relief plan. He issued 2 executive orders to safeguard access to reproductive health care. He signed the CHIPS and Science Act into law. He signed the PACT Act into law for our veterans. We have historically low unemployment rates, lower than we've had since the 1960s. He helped our economy recover through the American Rescue Plan. He confirmed our first black justice to the Supreme Court, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. He expanded the NATO alliance. He rallied our allies in support of Ukraine. He's made once-in-a-generation infrastructure investments. We have record enrollment in the Affordable Care Act. More Americans have health care now than ever before, over the objections of the Republicans, I might add. Historic funding for HBCUs, the historically black college and universities. He reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act. I mean, just step by step, there has been so much that has been accomplished. In the face of all this Republican obstruction, there's a video with the complete list over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. Welcome back. 35 minutes past the hour, picking up your calls. Eric in Fountain Valley, California. Hey, Eric, what's up? What's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I wanted to talk about the gerrymandering and the midterms. So you did the setup at the beginning of the hour about how gerrymandering is basically legalized by the Supreme Court. But what we hear is that in the state of New York, the legislature created districts which were overturned by their court, and therefore the Republicans drew the districts, and this resulted in 5 lost seats, which basically swung the House to the Republican side. And my question is, can the legislature of New York take this case to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court has already gone on record in saying that partisan gerrymandering is just fine?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that question, Eric. And I'm not that familiar with, I know that what happened in New York, basically the legislature said one thing, the Supreme Court said another, and that the legislature could have fought it and chose not to and went along with it. I also know that the Democratic Party, which holds a slim majority in New York State, because, keep in mind, most of New York, physically anyway, geographically, is fairly red. The Democratic Party in New York is, shall we say, fairly corrupt, and has been for a long, long time. Yeah. But very often the Democrats in the New York legislature vote with the Republicans. But that's a good. I'll try to remember to put that question to David when he comes on at the next hour, because we're going to have an.
It's frustrating that the Republicans fight so hard for their partisan gerrymander, but the Democrats give it up so easily, and as a result, the Democrats lost power. That's very frustrating.
Yeah, I'm with you. I completely agree. Thank you, Eric. Thanks for the call. Morris in Long Beach, California. Hey, Morris, what's on your mind today?
I'm going to tell you something. Everybody was impressed, and welcome back, Tom. You know what? I believe the reason why you have Jefferson doing your program, everybody knows he's not as brilliant as you are. But you know one thing you both have in common? You're kind men. And Jefferson is a kind man.
Yeah, he's
and
a good
I believe
person.
that's why you got him up there. But I could be wrong, but that's how I'm reading it. But I want to tell you something. When Trump came up with that special counsel, the whole world was like, oh, look at this, a special counsel. Well, let me tell you what I believe the Republicans think of the slick Willie move. That's what I'm going to call it. If when Garland went out and got his own special counsel, okay, because now the spotlight, it's no longer on the Attorney General anymore. The right-wing media, they would have ate Mr. Garland up if he had subpoenaed anything in life. Okay, they would have said it's a partisan subpoena.
Oh,
no
they were
doubt.
already doing it. Yeah.
But this guy, see, I'm on the right track here. But this guy, I call him Mr. Smith goes to Washington. But this guy here, Mr. Smith, Smith's background, his investigative background, this guy is a straight-up stud, Tom.
Yeah.
This is the kind of guy that can go after congressmen and senators, your Howleys, your Mike Lees, your Ted
That's
Cruz's.
right. And that's who really needs to worry, Morris, because this guy, you know, under the law that he's operating, or the rules under which he's operating, he can't be fired except for cause. I mean, you know, he's going to be there. And so even if Trump came back as president and brought Bill Barr with him, Bill Barr said on TV yesterday that he'd vote for Trump again. Even if that happened, you know, Mr. Smith is going to still be there prosecuting. And I think the people who have the most to fear, frankly, obviously Donald Trump has some concerns, shall we say. But the people who have the most to fear are the people who have been in on it with him. And you're right. A lot of those people are sitting in Congress right now.
You know, I'm going to tell you something. There's two kinds of bites, and I'm going to end you with this, Tom. They got the bite of alligator. The guy don't even chew his food. And that would be the Attorney General. That would be Mr. Garland. And then you got the bite of a whale. That would be John Smith goes to Washington. Talk later, Ben.
Interesting. Okay. Thanks a lot, Morris. Good to hear from you. Dwight in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota. Hey, Dwight, what's on your mind today?
Hello, Tom. Good to hear your voice.
Thank you.
Yes, my concern was this. We're talking about handing off the Trump affair to a prosecutor, but we haven't established a motive. And it seems like to me that, you know, that was you found the evidence, but do you have a motive? No one is asking why Trump stole those documents.
Actually, there was a long piece in the New York Times a couple days ago arguing that he was doing it because he's a souvenir hunter. I'm not buying it. I think he was doing it because he was, through back channels, funneling them off to Saudi Arabia, and that's why the Saudis have given, they just, you know, apparently just gave him $1 billion. They gave his son-in-law $2 billion. They gave his buddy Steve Mnuchin $1 billion. You know, they're throwing money around at the Trump family like there's no tomorrow.
It seems like they're just coming up with anything, but in an investigation, you will establish a motive, not just hearsay or innuendo about this or that. You know, you would have to establish a motive as to why he did what he did. And so far, I haven't heard that, and I'm kind of concerned about any investigation when there's no motive.
Yeah. Well, we'll see, Dwight. It's, I mean, we can speculate right now. My speculation is that he, you know, he wants to help out. He wanted something he could sell. That's that, you know, in my observation, Donald Trump, I don't know him, but I know people who know him. And my observation is that his entire life has been motivated by getting more money, more. So if he's going to steal something from Washington, D.C., he's going to do it because he can turn it into money. And, you know, I get, you know, he might want to keep the love letters from Kim Jong-un as a souvenir, but that's not the big stuff. The big stuff was, you know, the nuclear secrets of Russia, the nuclear secrets of some of our allies, that Russia or Saudi Arabia, you know, what's going on with Israel, that Saudi Arabia would pay a fortune for. And I think they have paid a fortune for it, frankly.
I think Trump is all about money and power. And if he could convert those documents into money and into power by establishing leverage in certain negotiations, I believe that. But that's only my speculation.
I think the other thing to remember, Dwight, is remember when Mohammed bin Salman, the dictator of Saudi Arabia, took over one of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in downtown, wherever it was, Riyadh or Jeddah or whatever, and you know, locked up a whole bunch of wealthy families and tortured some of them, killed one of them, and basically forced them to hand billions and billions of dollars over to him, purged a bunch of them from the government, all that kind of thing. Remember that event? My recollection, and you know, fact check me on this, but my recollection is that happened just weeks after Jared Kushner had gone over and visited with MBS. I'm guessing that Kushner took U.S. intelligence about dissenters within the Saudi government and handed that off to MBS, and MBS then called those people in and started torturing them and robbing them blind and stripping them of power, and that's why Jared Kushner got $2 billion. So that's part of why he did. Now, I could be wrong. That's purely speculation, but you know, it sounds right to me.
I think you're right. I think you're onto something there, and I think that if this was and I pray to God that it is a real investigation.
Yeah.
These types of things will come out. They will be exposed.
I agree. And this guy, this Jack Smith, this guy is like, you know, the phrase from the Financial Times this morning, a total badass. I think he really is, and he's going to be Trump and his co-conspirators' worst nightmare. At least, you know, knock wood, hopefully. Dwight, thanks for the call. John in Bellingham, Washington. Hey, John, what's up?
You know, that kind of makes sense that the Saudis received some intelligence and found the extent to which the United States is trying to undermine MBS and the Saudi royals.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised. They don't deserve to run that country. And I think that probably explains why they've started realigning themselves with Putin, because they see in Putin, you know, a kindred spirit.
Well, also at that time, Trump was actively realigning the United States with Putin.
Yeah, but of course, Trump was limited to a single term, and because of that, the United States has started realigning. But the other thing is, if Saudi Arabia really wants to realign with Russia, we should probably, and anyway, start normalizing our relationship with Iran. Culturally, the Iranian people are much more like us than the Saudis.
Yeah, I think you're right. And Iran actually has a history. It has a democratic tradition history. It ended in 1956, but they had an elected, Mossadegh was elected by the people. He was popularly elected. We helped overthrow him and install the Shah in 56. But yeah, spot on, John. I'm with you. Thanks for the call. Phil in Brookings, South Dakota. Hey, Phil, what's up?
Yeah, I wonder who decides to sell our oil reserves. Who does that, and why they're doing it?
What do you mean?
And then
you mean when Biden reduces the amount of oil in the oil reserves, how does it get distributed?
Well, yeah, you were saying we were selling our reserves to Venezuela. Who decides that?
Oh, the U.S. oil reserve is not going to Venezuela. What's happening is refined oil and gasoline and diesel are going to Brazil. And but then that's a decision made by the big oil companies. I don't know, but you raise an interesting question to which I don't know the answer. How, when we release oil from the U.S. oil reserves, I'm guessing it just gets sold into commodity markets, and it just goes into the market like any other product, and whoever buys the contracts or whoever buys it gets the most of it. But that's a good one. That's a question I don't know the answer to. Thanks a lot for the call. We'll continue our conversation in just a moment. It's 46 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. Boy, there's so much going on in the world. Helping you win the water cooler wars. We'll be right back with more of your calls in just a moment.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Right back with more of your calls in just a second. And welcome back. Chaz in Lakewood, Washington. Hey, Chaz, what's up?
Wie geht es Ihnen? Willkommen, mein Herr.
Danke. Mir geht es gut. What's up?
Sound good. Hey, I got a very prestigious Twitter follow a week ago I'm proud of, but that's not what you called as they say, right, Tom?
Okay. What was your prestigious Twitter follow?
You.
Oh, okay. Well, happy to help, Chaz.
Okay, so to the point, one of the only viable talking points the cons have is blue city mayors have higher crime. But I'm looking for a bumper sticker retort like red states have: higher crime, lower life expectancies, lower satisfaction quotient, higher maternal death rates, higher imprisonment, etc. Help us out here, Professor.
Well, I think you just did it, Chaz.
Yeah, I think I'm going to kind of stick with, blue city mayors have higher crime. Oh, yeah? Well, and then given the red states have higher crime, and then if they still haven't dropped their jaw yet, hit them with the 2-3 punch.
Yeah. This is one for Ziggy because he's the maven of all bumper stickers. We do.
Good thing he's on our side.
Yeah, we do need to be, and I think fairly quickly, coming up with our plans for the 2024 election, and how the Democratic Party is going to message these things. Chaz, thanks for the call. Bob in Detroit. Hey, Bob, what's up?
Yes, I wanted to add to your conversation about what the effect will be of possibly prosecuting Trump. And I tend to agree with your original take on it, which is that it may actually work to his benefit, comparing it to what's going on with foreign politics and so on.
Short term, anyway. I mean, if he ends up in jail, it won't work to his benefit. But other than that, yes.
Yeah, but see, that's the thing. I mean, as it plays out, I think related to this is Trump's decision to make his announcement when he did, and because he was getting advice even from Republicans, delay your announcement, delay it, wait till after the Georgia runoff. And he said, no, I'm going ahead with it right now. So I think he's kind of, in a sense, beaten Merrick Garland to the punch. So from now on, anything that they do against Trump will look political, like, Trump announced for president, now look, they're just trying to tear him down.
Right.
And
and we all saw that coming, by the way.
Right, but I think the effect of this politically will have a real effect on really impeding any such movements in that direction.
Movement? You mean prosecutions or politically?
Yes, well, both.
Oh, I don't. I think the prosecution track is going to run on its very own timetable, its very own steam. It's going to be based on, the facts and the witnesses and all that sort of thing. I don't think that Jack Smith or Merrick Garland handing this thing off to Jack Smith was a brilliant stroke, in my opinion. And I think Trump is toast.
I guess I'm disagreeing with that because I think even your guest host last week mentioned the subject where that's very. No former president has ever been prosecuted.
But we never had a former president who was a naked criminal.
Yeah, but it doesn't give a good impression.
I realize there isn't a precedent other than arguably Nixon. I mean, there was Leon Jaworski wanted to prosecute Nixon, but Jerry Ford pardoned him. I think lacking that pardon, he may well have. Bob, thanks for the call. We'll see. We'll see how it shakes out. It's going to be interesting times. Get the popcorn. Hey, I have a new book out. It's called The Hidden History of Neoliberalism, How Reaganism Gutted America and How to Restore Its Greatness. Greg Palast calls it a hand grenade of a book. You can pick it up wherever fine books are available. Tag you're it. There are no good solid numbers on it, but it appears that the majority of people who have Medicare Advantage programs or plans believe that they're on Medicare. This is certainly how Medicare Advantage is sold. Oh, you're missing out on benefits under Medicare. It's Medicare Part C, don't you know? C for commercial, right? But people don't realize that when you sign up for Medicare Advantage, you are leaving behind Medicare, and you may never be able to get back to it, or at least not in the way that you could have if you had signed up for it when you were 65 and you stayed with it. And now stepping into this void come Congressman Mark Pocan and Congressman Ro Khanna with the new Save Medicare Act that would prevent this kind of deceptive advertising and marketing by forbidding insurance companies and HMOs and whatnot from using the word Medicare to sell these for-profit plans or these so-called Medicare Advantage plans. We all need to be supportive of this. There's a whole video about it over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. Welcome back. 52 minutes past the hour, and Clarence in Jacksonville, North Carolina. It says here you disagree with me, Clarence. My apologies. If I'd caught that earlier, I would have put you on earlier. What's up?
Yes, sir. Mr. Hartmann, I'm trying to stay focused. Listening to your show, some of the people calling in, and trying to stay focused, not get off too off track. Well, let's just think back for a minute. I am a Republican. I did vote for President Trump twice, and if he runs again and gets the nomination, probably vote for him the third time. First question, and I'm going to go through this just quick and all. How in the world did our country get so divided? Democrat, Republicans had each other's votes, so on and so forth. I thought we were all for the better good of the USA. Second question.
Well, let's deal with these one at a time here, Clarence.
Okay. All right.
I think that your question is a really important one, and I don't have an easy or glib answer for you. I do think that the decision that Richard Nixon made, and I'm not just blaming Nixon for this, he was simply picking up the mantle from the Democrats before him. But the decision that Richard Nixon made in 1968 to openly embrace a white racist vote in the South and take that away from the Democratic Party and do it, explicitly, that sort of began the process. But I think the real crisis began in 1976 and 78 when the Supreme Court legalized political bribery. And at that point, you had some fossil fuel billionaires and other very, very wealthy people who started buying politicians. And what they found was that one of the most effective ways to rob all of us blind was to keep us fighting with each other. And so, you now have political systems, arguably with both parties, but I think most of it's on the right, that are basically devoted to ginning up hate and fear.
Well, that's where my divide differs. I feel absolutely the opposite. And I'm an over-road driver. I'm on the road right now, so I'm trying to concentrate not to run anybody over and all that stuff. But I feel just the opposite of what you just said there and all. And a lot of people do. And that was the first question off. The second question, and I appreciate your answer. It was a little complicated, and I will look at something a little bit more direct.
Well, let me, Clarence, before we move to the second question, let me just ask you. You listen to conservative media a lot, and I'm sure that you're hearing a lot of outrage, right? We need to be pissed off about this. We need to be pissed off about that. Quack, quack, quack. Are you hearing that on this program? Are you hearing that on this channel?
Sir, Mr. Hartmann, I have to be honest. I was channel surfing and run across it and paused onto it and all. I like to educate myself on both sides.
Okay. All right. So your second question.
I said I voted for Trump. Trump could lose my vote. I'm for the good of the country, period. That's what it is. We're all one nation under God.
By the way, Clarence, we just have a minute left before the hour is going to end here, so let's get to it.
Yes, sir. I'll be right quick. Yes, sir. The second question is, back when Donald Trump come down the escalator, they started investigating Mr. Trump.
They did?
All through, they did.
Who did?
They investigated. Mueller report, Congress, 2 impeachments, you name it.
Oh, all that stuff came quite a ways down the road, but you're absolutely right about the Marco Rubio hired the what became that Steele dossier. He hired the Steele people as opposition research in the Republican primary, and then when Marco Rubio lost the Republican primary, the Hillary Clinton campaign bought that from his campaign. But, that happens to every politician. As soon as you declare, somebody else is doing Apple research.
Yeah,
look it up. It's true.
I'm not. I can't deny it because I don't know. I'm not. I have noticed on your show you're dealing with a lot of speculations and accusations.
Well, this is not speculation. This is easily documented. Clarence,
what did Biden's Reduction Act do to the consumer?
The Inflation Reduction Act?
Come back in. Yes, sir.
What
It
is
wasn't
it to the
fuel.
consumer?
It wasn't food prices. What did we do?
That's a good question. I don't have a, we're out of time, Clarence. I don't have a quick answer for you, Clarence. So let me think about that one.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.
We say fight back!
Today, we're reading about Thunderdome politics, an uncivil war taking back our democracy in an age of Trumpian disinformation and Thunderdome politics by Greg Sargent, the Washington Post columnist. This is from his chapter on voter suppression. It's page 37. Republicans and Democrats inhabit different political realities, as mentioned in a previous chapter. But there are certain facts about our politics that are just objectively true. One of them is this. Generally speaking, efforts to make it harder to vote are almost always pushed by Republicans. You cannot understand what is happening in American politics right now without recognizing this stark and very fundamental difference between the two major political parties. During this decade, procedural hurdles were put into place in around 20 states that in some manner or other have made it harder to vote or to register to vote, or have undone previous efforts to make voting or registering easier, or have otherwise threatened serious disenfranchisement. Most of them were the creation of Republican lawmakers and officials. The difference in the two parties' national platforms for 2016 tells the story. The GOP platform champions additional hurdles that are absurdly disproportionate to the phantom abuse it alleges, while the Democratic platform champions multiple specific ways to make it easier to vote, not harder. The most common and controversial of methods used by Republicans to suppress Democratic turnout is the requirement that would-be voters present identification at the polls. The game here tends to turn on requiring forms of ID that some groups are less likely to have, making participation harder for them. Other restrictions include techniques like cutting back on early voting and making it harder to register, both of which have, in recent years, been instituted in multiple states. Republicans who have passed laws making it harder to vote have tended to claim such measures are necessary to protect against, quote, voter fraud. We'll look at this in more detail below, but for now, note that most of the states that have passed such measures did so while under Republican control. As New York University political scientist Samuel Isikoff has memorably put it, the single predictor necessary to determine whether a state will impose voter access restrictions is whether Republicans control the ballot access process. Scholars trace the modern era of warfare over election rules to the intensely contested presidential election of 2000. In which a divided Supreme Court halted the recount in Florida, throwing the presidency to George W. Bush. The closeness and partisan acrimony of that contest, combined with the intense national focus on election rules that accompanied the court battle over it, helped persuade both parties to invest much more attention and energy on those rules. As a result, both the implementation of measures restricting the ballot and the legal battles over them have intensified in recent years. A brief glance at the surprising history of voter ID laws begins to tell the story of this tightening. In the 1970s, several states implemented voter ID measures, but all of them provided for ways that voters without the proper ID could cast a ballot. By 2000, there were 14 such laws, and they had been implemented by politicians in both parties. But by the mid-2000s, amid rising post-2000 acrimony, a handful of red states began implementing voter ID laws that the nonpartisan National Conference of State Legislatures described as, quote, strict, meaning that they make it easy to disqualify those who don't pass muster. After one of those laws in Indiana was challenged and then upheld in 2008 by the Supreme Court, an escalation began that gained momentum in the Obama era. From 2010 onward, the adoption of voter ID laws in general and of strict ones in particular accelerated. Though a handful were blocked in the courts, as of this writing, a total of 34 states have voter ID laws in effect, 24 that are deemed non-strict and 10 that are deemed strict. The strict ones are in red states or in swing states where they were implemented by Republicans. The story is very similar if you evaluate the state's voting rules in a broader way, by including not just voter ID measures, but also cutbacks to early voting and restrictions on registration. Here the trend is just as pronounced. After the 2010 elections, the Brennan Center for Justice documented a sharp rise in efforts to pass such measures in the state legislatures across the country. Not all these efforts bore fruit, but many did. By the time voting took place in Election Day 2016, some 14 states had these new restrictions in place for the first time in a presidential election. Now, as of this writing, by the Brennan Center's count, some 20 states have successfully implemented either strict voting ID requirements or cutbacks to early voting or restrictions on registration or other measures with meaningful disenfranchising effects. If you're a liberal who's frustrated by the seemingly unbreakable Republican dominance of national politics, not to mention GOP control of most state governments across the country, then the chances are that these restrictions figure heavily into your explanation of this GOP supremacy. Indeed, social media has been absolutely saturated in recent years with variations of the lament that Republican political dominance is largely maintained through a combination of nefarious and undemocratic tactics, such as ballot restrictions that keep constituencies unfriendly to the GOP from voting, and extreme gerrymanders that have, in effect, built a fortress around the GOP's majority in the House of Representatives. Democrats frequently invoke the GOP's use of these tactics, often justifiably, to raise money and to galvanize turnout. This narrative contains some important truths. Some of the forms that these restrictions on voting access have taken in recent years are diabolically obvious in their efforts to keep constituencies supportive of Democrats from voting. Still others boast the distinction of being more insidiously designed and thus less obvious in their intentions. The book is An Uncivil War by Greg Sargent of The Washington Post.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to the third hour of our program. On the line with us is David Daley, a senior fellow at Fair Vote, former editor-in-chief at Salon, author most recently of Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. And previously, he's been on this program about it, Rat Effed, Why Your Vote Doesn't Count. He's also a regular contributor to Democracy SOS on Substack, which is sponsored by Fair Vote. Fairvote.org is the website. Dave Daley #3 or at Fairvote are the Twitter handles. And Dave, welcome back to the program. You wrote this brilliant piece, the GOP's bid to claim a rigged House majority. I briefly touched on earlier in the program on how, were it not for gerrymandering, Democrats would control the House of Representatives right now. You want to lay the case out for us?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me back on, Tom. Republicans are going to hold about a narrow 5 or 6 seat advantage in the U.S. House. They quite simply would not have that advantage if not for the seats that they themselves in state legislatures around the country tilted in their direction, or seats that the U.S. Supreme Court in a handful of cases on voting rights made it much easier for them to draw in such a way as to elect white conservative Republicans. When you do the math on this, when you look at the 4 seats that Ron DeSantis effectively stole in Florida, when you look at the seats from Texas and Tennessee, when you look at the seats in Wisconsin, in Ohio, where congressional and state legislative elections were held on a map that the state Supreme Court, not once, not twice, but 6 different times ruled unconstitutional. When you look at the after effects of Shelby County versus Holder, which effectively undid preclearance, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act back in 2013. This was the first redistricting cycle since then. And so many states across the South and the Southwest did not have to preclear maps that limited the voice of racial minorities in those states. And then there's Merrill versus Milligan, the case from Alabama, which effectively narrowed Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in a clear-cut case from Alabama, a textbook voting rights case that then had a ripple effect onto, effectively racist maps that were also drawn in Georgia and Louisiana. So more than a dozen seats, I would say, claimed by Republicans. It's going to make the difference when you look at control of the House.
Well, there's this old saying, don't bring a knife to a gunfight, but, or do bring a gun to a knife. You get my point. Why is it that Democratic states are basically voluntarily disarming in the face of this? I get that it's the right thing to do, but it seems politically naive. What am I missing?
Well, I think it's complicated. It's complicated in that the U.S. Supreme Court in 2019, and in the Rucho decision, they said that partisan gerrymandering is not going to be regulated by the courts. They closed the federal courts to these claims, and they said state courts can go ahead and do it. And so what we saw this cycle is that Republican-controlled courts that the right has effectively stacked and packed over the course of the last 10 plus years in Florida, in Texas, in Georgia, and Arizona, right? That those courts effectively blessed or allowed Republican gerrymanders. And then you had courts in Maryland, courts in New York that were largely packed by Democratic governors in those states over the years, less recently in Maryland, which has had a Republican governor, but nevertheless is still a fairly a liberal court. And those courts ruled in the public interest in favor of fair maps. And so that, in addition, helped tilt the playing field. If, it's not only if, I think you're absolutely right. I think Democrats have brought a butter knife to a gunfight for a long, long time. But now that so much of the battlefield has moved into the courts, you have Republican judges who are willing to enforce entirely different rules for their side than ones that Democrats insist on.
So if if California was to, and I realize they have, these commissions, which I believe came about by ballot initiative, or was it enacted a legislature? I don't recall.
Ballot initiative in California.
Initiative. Yeah. So that's going to be, difficult to change, but nonetheless, I mean, if California, New York, some large states, Michigan's now under Republican control. If some of these larger states were to say, what's good for the goose, here we are throwing cliches at each other, but we're gonna play this damn game too. And we're going to gerrymander the hell out of our states. And, if people are upset about that, that's wonderful, because that might produce the outrage and impetus to just end all gerrymandering. Why are the Democratic states not doing that? It's not that they're being blocked by the courts, is it? I mean, the courts are ruling that, fair maps are okay when Democratic states are coming before the courts saying we want the fair maps. But correct me if I'm wrong here, I don't recall any Democratic states coming before the courts in the last decade or so saying we really want this heavily gerrymandered map that is going to, throw 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 more Democrats into the House of Representatives.
Well, that's what happened in New York, really. You had Democrats in New York who played a very aggressive game. They did an aggressive gerrymander there that was designed exactly as you say to try to compensate for what Republicans were doing in Ohio and
the New York Supreme Court,
Florida and Georgia. And
but
the
they
New
didn't
York
appeal that to the
Supreme
U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court, if they were at all consistent, would have said, well, it's fine with us.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that what is the problem for Democrats is that this is a numbers game. And that the last gerrymander that Republicans pulled off back in 2010 was so effective that they still continue to hold sway in so many of these purple states, in Wisconsin, in North Carolina, in Florida, Ohio. And so even if Democrats were to wildly, insanely gerrymander New York and California and Illinois, there's just not much juice to squeeze out of the lemon, if I can start talking in cliches.
Yeah, all they need, though, is 6 more seats.
All they need is 6 more, right? But if Republicans were to keep going hog wild in all of the places they had, and
they will, David, they will.
Yes.
I guess the larger question is this even a reasonable strategy? I mean, what's the most effective strategy for trying to change this? Is it to amend the U.S. Constitution? Is it to pass some sort of law that may or may not get around some of these Supreme Court decisions? Is it at the state level? I mean, what should the Democrats be doing, in your opinion? You're a real expert on this stuff. You've educated yourself on it, far better than I have.
No,
where do we go? What do we do?
Gosh, it is super complicated. But I think that there's 2 things that we really need to be thinking about. The first is a national standard on this topic, because as long as Ohio and Florida and Texas are allowed to do whatever it is that they want, and hand-picked state Supreme Courts will allow it, it is, you're always going to have Texas and Florida and these renegade Republican states playing by different rules than California and New York. It's simply the way it is.
Would such a law survive judicial review at the Supreme Court?
It's a great question. When the court closed the door to being the arbiter of these cases themselves, they said Congress ought to go ahead and pass this law. Now, Congress has passed other laws on voting rights in the past, and this court has been systematically undoing them one by one. Right. But I think Democrats really missed an opportunity here on the Freedom to Vote Act, which included really strong provisions against partisan gerrymandering, mandating commissions in every state, and truly independent commissions, not the kind of bipartisan buddymanders we see in so many states. And Manchin and Sinema and the filibuster stood in the way. I think this is an opportunity that we are going to consider a missed one that will be regretted for a long time.
Yeah, it's grim stuff. The article is the GOP over at thenation.com is the GOP's bid to claim a rigged House majority by David Daley. And of course, all of David's other great work at fairvote.com or fairvote.org, excuse me, and on Twitter, Dave Daley #3. Dave, thanks so much for dropping by today.
Always a pleasure, Tom. Anytime. Thanks.
Great speaking with you. We'll be back. It's 15 minutes past the hour.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
For our caller, Clarence, I want to tell you about the Inflation Reduction Act and AARP and private Medicare, and Arizonans going into hiding? And welcome back. Picking up your phone calls here. Jules in St. Louis, Missouri. Hey, Jules, what's on your mind today?
Oh, fine. My compliments. I'm your biggest fan.
Well, thank you.
But anyway,
Jules.
To get to the point. Yeah, I mean that too. I had a relative, and this will be brief. I had a relative that seemed to always be able to get away with murder. Not literally, but some pretty wicked stuff. And I found out he belonged to a secret organization, and that there was a sign that they flashed. And I think that's what's happening with Merrick Garland as to why he won't prosecute, and then finally dumped it off on a special prosecutor.
Okay,
And
what's your relative's secret society?
I'd rather not say, please.
Okay, all right. I doubt it, frankly, Jules. There have been secret societies in American history. George Washington's inaugural parade was a Masonic parade. The Masons, each one of the Masonic temples came and brought their own little banners. I mean, we don't have photographs in the era, but we've got paintings and etchings of that and the historical record. There was a secret society that grew up in Massachusetts in the 1840s. It really started, but they really didn't gain power until the 1880s, as I recall. It was called the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner, and their slogan was "I know nothing," and they had a secret handshake. And they were called the Know Nothings, and they seized power over the state of Massachusetts for a couple of gubernatorial cycles, and played a huge role in generating public schools in Boston because they were trying to break the back of the Catholic political power in that state. And of course you had the Ku Klux Klan, which arguably wasn't so secret, but it was a society that had a lot of political power. So, your question's not, a nutty one or a conspiracy, theory one. But that said, there was a time I speculated on the air whether Garland was even a member of the Federalist Society. Turns out he's not, never has been. So I don't think that there's that what we're looking at here is secret society stuff, like you're describing, Jules. I think it's more that it takes time to build a criminal prosecution, particularly a large one, particularly something like espionage or treason. And the Department of Justice has been working on this diligently. They've got a federal grand jury. And when Trump announced that he was running for president and Biden said that he was going to run again, the imperative that Garland felt, and I believe this is true. I mean, I think when he said this, he was speaking the truth. That was that he needed to depoliticize the effort. He needed to bring in a guy who was being seen as independent of politics. Now, arguably that's what they did with Ken Starr when they went after Bill Clinton. Ken Starr was nakedly political. That's not the case with Jack Smith. Ken Starr was an old Republican, operative. He was blatantly political. But I think that Jack Smith is going to be a serious guy, and he's going to take this on in a serious way. So, Jules, thanks for the call and thanks for the question. My short answer is no. I don't think there's anything having to do with secret societies here beyond, just the normal, obvious societies of wealth and power that Donald Trump is able to wield. We'll be right back. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. Are you feeling sad and depressed? Are you anxious, worried about the future, feeling isolated and alone? You might be suffering from capitalism. Symptoms include homelessness, unemployment, poverty, hunger, feelings of powerlessness, fear, listlessness, disenfranchisement, isolation, loss of identity, self-loathing, feelings of guilt, loss of free speech, incarceration, fines, suicidal thoughts, death, or revolution. Now, that's kind of the funny one, but the serious thing is that capitalism, unregulated capitalism, unrestrained, laissez-faire, neoliberal capitalism, no income tax capitalism, no regulation capitalism, does produce this kind of a crisis. And we need to acknowledge that. We need to, and thank goodness we are moving in the right direction, I think, back toward regulated capitalism like Franklin Roosevelt gave us, rather than the unregulated neoliberal capitalism of the Trump years. I got a video about this over at ThomHartmann.com. You can check it out. Tag You're It. And welcome back. A lot to talk about. AARP, David Sirota's newsletter, The Lever. This one is written by Matthew Cunningham Cook. over at levernews.com, is writing about the American Association of Retired Persons. They no longer call themselves that. It's now AARP, but that's what they used to call themselves. And while Medicare Advantage is a ripoff of you and me, it costs our government more than $7 billion a year, more than normal Medicare would. And most of that money goes right into the pockets, much of that money goes right into the pockets of the CEOs and stockholders of these giant insurance companies, specifically $814 million a year in profits. But AARP is openly promoting Medicare Advantage. By the way, their CEO made $1.3 million last year, in 2020, the year before, yes, in 2020. They have 38 million members, and this is interesting. Quote, throughout the current public health emergency, we have supported the expansion of supplemental benefits in Medicare Advantage to help alleviate the unprecedented healthcare crisis brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic, writes a letter from AARP. Starting the Medicare Advantage part was added by the lever, but if you look at the context, that was what they were talking about. The lever notes, starting in 2021, AARP also launched a lucrative partnership with a major Medicare outsourcing firm, Oak Street Health, which is a participant in the ACO Realizing Equity, Access, and Community Health Program, also known as the ACO REACH program, that privatizes Medicare benefits for seniors without their consent. AARP earned $814 million in royalties. That figure is double what they collect in dues. Their motto is to serve, not be served, but what they're serving is apparently Medicare Advantage. Susan Rogers, the president of Physicians for National Health Program, PNHP, pointed out that AARP's website contained essentially no information, no independent information on Medicare Advantage. Quote, if you go to their website and search for Medicare, the first information up there is Medicare Advantage, she said. Nothing about traditional Medicare, nothing. And the ACO REACH program, of course, will throw you into a Medicare Advantage program without you even knowing it if your doctor is hooked up with one of these groups. So rough stuff. Clarence a truck driver called a little earlier and said, what's in the Inflation Reduction Act for average consumers? And so I said I'll do a little homework here over the break. Number one, the expanded tax credits for energy-efficient commercial buildings, energy-efficient homes, and electric vehicles will include bonus credits for businesses that pay prevailing wages and hire registered apprentices, ensuring local wages are not undercut by low-road contractors. In other words, it will increase wages across the country. It stops companies from ripping off workers. It penalizes companies that promise to pay prevailing wages but don't follow through. For the first time ever, the Inflation Reduction Act establishes Make It in America provisions for the use of American-made equipment. The law provides expanded clean energy tax credits for wind, solar, nuclear, clean energy, clean hydrogen, clean fuels, and carbon capture. It makes the tax code fairer by cracking down on multimillionaires, billionaires, and corporations that evade their taxes. No family making less than $400,000 a year will see a tax increase. The Inflation Reduction Act will actually raise revenue for the federal government by going after tax dodgers, particularly wealthy individuals and giant corporations. It imposes a 1% surcharge on corporate stock buybacks to encourage businesses to invest in their people rather than in their CEOs and their shareholders. It will revitalize American manufacturing. It builds the American clean energy supply chains. It supports American workers with targeted tax incentives aimed at manufacturing. It strengthens America's manufacturing base, promotes domestic sourcing and American jobs. For example, clean energy tax credits are increased if the amount of American steel used in wind projects meets the domestic content threshold. Bonus credits are available to employers who use prevailing wages and apprenticeships. I kind of mentioned that before. And it creates good paying union jobs all across the United States. It also lowers health care costs. The Inflation Reduction Act will protect Medicare recipients from catastrophic drug costs by placing an out-of-pocket cap of $35 a month on insulin, and also allowing Medicare to negotiate for the first time since I think it was 2003, the Republicans got it passed that Medicare couldn't negotiate drug prices. Pretty sure it was 2003, might have been 2005. But for the first time now, on 10 drugs only, we want to expand that, Medicare can negotiate drug prices, which is going to lower prices for everybody, lower drug prices for everybody in the United States. So that's what the Inflation Reduction Act does for average people. I got to tell you about the GOP chairman of the Merritt County Board of Supervisors who has gone into hiding, and what's up with Disney, and then I'll pick up your calls.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
So stick around. We'll be right back. It's 27 minutes past the hour.
Today, we're reading about Thunderdome politics, an uncivil war taking back our democracy in an age of Trumpian disinformation and Thunderdome politics by Greg Sargent, the Washington Post columnist. This is from his chapter on voter suppression. It's page 37. Republicans and Democrats inhabit different political realities, as mentioned in a previous chapter. But there are certain facts about our politics that are just objectively true. One of them is this. Generally speaking, efforts to make it harder to vote are almost always pushed by Republicans. You cannot understand what is happening in American politics right now without recognizing this stark and very fundamental difference between the two major political parties. During this decade, procedural hurdles were put into place in around 20 states that in some manner or other have made it harder to vote or to register to vote, or have undone previous efforts to make voting or registering easier, or have otherwise threatened serious disenfranchisement. Most of them were the creation of Republican lawmakers and officials. The difference in the two parties' national platforms for 2016 tells the story. The GOP platform champions additional hurdles that are absurdly disproportionate to the phantom abuse it alleges, while the Democratic platform champions multiple specific ways to make it easier to vote, not harder. The most common and controversial of methods used by Republicans to suppress Democratic turnout is the requirement that would-be voters present identification at the polls. The game here tends to turn on requiring forms of ID that some groups are less likely to have, making participation harder for them. Other restrictions include techniques like cutting back on early voting and making it harder to register, both of which have, in recent years, been instituted in multiple states. Republicans who have passed laws making it harder to vote have tended to claim such measures are necessary to protect against, quote, voter fraud. We'll look at this in more detail below, but for now, note that most of the states that have passed such measures did so while under Republican control. As New York University political scientist Samuel Isikoff has memorably put it, the single predictor necessary to determine whether a state will impose voter access restrictions is whether Republicans control the ballot access process. Scholars trace the modern era of warfare over election rules to the intensely contested presidential election of 2000. In which a divided Supreme Court halted the recount in Florida, throwing the presidency to George W. Bush. The closeness and partisan acrimony of that contest, combined with the intense national focus on election rules that accompanied the court battle over it, helped persuade both parties to invest much more attention and energy on those rules. As a result, both the implementation of measures restricting the ballot and the legal battles over them have intensified in recent years. A brief glance at the surprising history of voter ID laws begins to tell the story of this tightening. In the 1970s, several states implemented voter ID measures, but all of them provided for ways that voters without the proper ID could cast a ballot. By 2000, there were 14 such laws, and they had been implemented by politicians in both parties. But by the mid-2000s, amid rising post-2000 acrimony, a handful of red states began implementing voter ID laws that the nonpartisan National Conference of State Legislatures described as, quote, strict, meaning that they make it easy to disqualify those who don't pass muster. After one of those laws in Indiana was challenged and then upheld in 2008 by the Supreme Court, an escalation began that gained momentum in the Obama era. From 2010 onward, the adoption of voter ID laws in general and of strict ones in particular accelerated. Though a handful were blocked in the courts, as of this writing, a total of 34 states have voter ID laws in effect, 24 that are deemed non-strict and 10 that are deemed strict. The strict ones are in red states or in swing states where they were implemented by Republicans. The story is very similar if you evaluate the state's voting rules in a broader way, by including not just voter ID measures, but also cutbacks to early voting and restrictions on registration. Here the trend is just as pronounced. After the 2010 elections, the Brennan Center for Justice documented a sharp rise in efforts to pass such measures in state legislatures across the country. Not all these efforts bore fruit, but many did. By the time voting took place in Election Day 2016, some 14 states had these new restrictions in place for the first time in a presidential election. Now, as of this writing, by the Brennan Center's count, some 20 states have successfully implemented either strict voting ID requirements or cutbacks to early voting or restrictions on registration or other measures with meaningful disenfranchising effects. If you're a liberal who's frustrated by the seemingly unbreakable Republican dominance of national politics, not to mention GOP control of most state governments across the country, then the chances are that these restrictions figure heavily into your explanation of this GOP supremacy. Indeed, social media has been absolutely saturated in recent years with variations of the lament that Republican political dominance is largely maintained through a combination of nefarious and undemocratic tactics, such as ballot restrictions that keep constituencies unfriendly to the GOP from voting, and extreme gerrymanders that have, in effect, built a fortress around the GOP's majority in the House of Representatives. Democrats frequently invoke the GOP's use of these tactics, often justifiably, to raise money and to galvanize turnout. This narrative contains some important truths. Some of the forms that these restrictions on voting access have taken in recent years are diabolically obvious in their efforts to keep constituencies supportive of Democrats from voting. Still others boast the distinction of being more insidiously designed and thus less obvious in their intentions. The book is An Uncivil War by Greg Sargent of The Washington Post. Our 1-hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3-hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. There's an amazing number of criminal and civil investigations and lawsuits against Donald Trump, that range from the espionage grand jury investigation. This is a federal criminal investigation into Trump and people around him committing espionage, to the January 6th grand jury investigation, a separate grand jury looking into the crime of trying to overthrow the government. Obviously, you've got the Trump Organization tax fraud investigation, Letitia James in New York State. You've got the Trump Organization tax fraud being investigated also by the city. Fulton County, Georgia is looking into, Trump's attempts to get 11,780 votes out of Brad Raffensperger. You got the January 6th committee that goes, without elaboration. The Senate is investigating Bill Barr's Justice Department, the former Justice Department. And then there's a whole series of individual lawsuits against Trump, from Mary Trump to others. I've got a video with a complete list over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. So in Arizona, the Republican County Supervisor, Maricopa County Supervisor Bill Gates, no relation to the billionaire, he's just the chair of the County Board of Supervisors, he has gone into hiding because apparently Kari Lake, the loser, the Republican who lost the gubernatorial race in Arizona, has been yelling and screaming about election fraud. And he confirmed on Sunday, yesterday, that he was transferred to an undisclosed location. He's been provided, he and his family, with a security detail. And they have faced months, they say, of escalating death threats that make it increasingly difficult for them to do their job. The top lawyer for the county has also reported being threatened by an RNC attorney working with Lake's campaign. Not good. Not good stuff. Not good to know about. Meanwhile, over at Disney, Bob Chapek has been the president of Disney. Bob Iger was president before him. Bob Iger had been with the company 50 years, literally worked his way up to CEO. And he left 3 years ago with a giant golden parachute and was replaced by Chapek, or Chapek. Chapek? Yeah. And but Chapek apparently made the mistake of going to war with Ron DeSantis over his "Don't Say Gay" law. And so now they're bringing back Bob Iger.
And this is, in fact, this was so sudden. Chapek was supposed to introduce some sort of football game or something, and everybody was expecting him to show up, and he didn't. And it's because Iger is now in charge, and he has said that he's agreed to serve for 2 years. Now, Chapek just got a 3-year renewal of his contract. It's going to cost them apparently $200 million to buy him out and make him go away, which is pretty mind-boggling when you think of it. Is anybody worth $200 million a year, or for 3 years? It's an enormous amount of money. Anyhow, let's pick up your phone calls here. Rudy in Atlanta, Georgia. Hey, Rudy, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom, it's good to hear you, man. It's torture sometimes when you have to wait when you're hearing other people with other comments, but let me see if I can refocus. Tom, it's great persecution is the word I was using, right, in being righteous. It's not being political, and it sure isn't being religious. I'm just saying doing the right thing. So that being said, this is just what I get from Merrick Garland. And I think that the American public, for the most part, we need to be a little patient. I really believe that the administration and Merrick Garland understands what's happening worldwide as far as with these right-wing nationalist people taking their stance around the world with this Christianity and all of this, other stuff that clouds what is, in my mind, being righteous. I really believe at the end of the day, we want to hold Trump. We want to hold this guy up as long as we can in the media, because I was listening to that trucker guy. Tom, it's nothing righteous about what Donald Trump represents. Nothing.
Well, the guy's an accused rapist. He's committed, fairly obviously massive tax fraud and bank fraud. He's not a good man. I mean, he stole from his own family.
And that being said, stole. Because Tom, there is no honor amongst thieves. None.
Yeah, there you go.
And these people that are saying, I'm conservative and hey man, I'm trying to be righteous in my life. And I'm going to say this in final, Tom. I would much rather fall on the sword of righteousness any day. Righteous. Free from politics, free from religion, but doing the right thing. Any day.
Right, which should be the litmus test for both religion and politics.
For anyone, Tom.
Yeah.
For anyone.
Yeah.
And that's a choice that we have to, when we wake up every day, try to be righteous in what we stand for. And what we're going through right now is a prime example of when you stand for nothing, you will fall for anything.
Yeah, you're right.
So that's where I'm at, Tom. Just be righteous.
I'm with you. Rudy, thank you. Thank you. Words of wisdom.
Take care.
Ziggy in Oneonta, New York. Hey, Ziggy, how's NoBribes.com doing?
NBribes.com, and we're doing good. I'm working on stuff for 2024 now. I think that's the way we need to go.
Okay.
And before I get to my topic, I wanted to just give you a little piece of trivia. Jack Smith went to college here at Oneonta State before he went to Harvard.
How about that?
Yeah, I thought that was kind of neat. Never met him, don't know of him, but
homeboy makes good.
Was kind of neat. Yeah. Anyways, I'm calling about this New York State gerrymandering that you were talking about, and I don't want to be part of a circular firing squad, but you got to call them like you see them. Our biggest problem is our New York State Democratic chairman, Jay Jacobs, is a lobbyist. And he hasn't really put any money into anything for us, especially the people. And he's basically lining his pockets, in my opinion.
Yeah, this is what I said earlier. The Democratic Party in New York State is probably the most corrupt Democratic Party in the country, at least as far as I can tell.
And we need to get rid of them here as well as in the Republican Party. I don't care where it is. People who are taking this money,
corruption
is
wrong.
To get rid of them.
Period.
We need to call them out. And if you remember right, last year I was calling your show continuously trying to motivate New Yorkers to go vote for the 5 ballot initiatives. If they had passed, this would have been prevented. But the Democratic Party spent $0 on it. My local Democratic committee didn't even know about it. And meanwhile, the Republicans spent close to $5 million to get them defeated.
Wow.
And, you know, we just got to get rid of these kind of people running our party.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. Arguably corrupt Democrats are even worse than corrupt Republicans because, you know, most Democratic voters assume that a D after the name means that there's some level of integrity there. I don't think most Republican voters, I may be wrong, but I don't think most Republican voters anymore. I know in my dad's day, you know, he believed, I mean, he was an Eisenhower Republican. He believed an R after the name meant, you know, somebody who stood for something and you could trust what they had to say and all that kind of thing. But now we've got, after having a crotch grabber in the White House who, you know, proudly has been accused of assaulting over 20 women, has been sued over 3,000 times for refusing to pay his bills, and for, you know, had his phony university shut down, had his phony charity shut down. All 3 of his children had to, under court order, had to go to school to learn how to run a charity in a way that's not fraudulent. I mean, he's been literally convicted of fraud, and now we're finding that his company has been engaged in massive tax fraud for decades. And this is the guy Republicans are saying, yeah, I like that. Maybe he won't be fraudulent against me. You know, I get, you know, that there are some white Republicans who think that, yeah, he's going to keep the black people in their place and keep the brown people out of the country. But, you know, really is having corruption being ripped off by this guy the price that you're willing to pay for your white supremacy? Really? It's incredible. Ziggy, thanks for the call, and good luck with endbribes.com. Thanks a lot for that. Earl in Hyde Park, Illinois. Hey, Earl, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. Excuse my voice. It's kind of breaking up a little bit. I want to address Clarence again, but I'm going to answer your last question just before you came to me. Yes, they really do believe that the price of whatever Trump brings to the table is worth maintaining the lifestyle that they envision is America. And I'm going to suggest to you that it's not only the Republicans, but it's also the liberals and the independents who have a false impression of how great America has been in the past. They don't take in consideration what has happened to the Native people. They don't take into consideration what has happened to black people, Latino, brown people, those that don't consider themselves white, and Asian, and so on and so forth. They really believe that America was this great bastion of equality and goodness for everyone. And when it wasn't, you know, because I'm black, I understand how heavy-handed it was on the black people and people of poverty and everything else.
Yeah.
But,
good point, Earl. And you know, for a lot of white people, it's easy to just kind of live in this little white bubble and pretend that the rest of all that stuff isn't happening. But it has been happening. And of course, now you've got Republican politicians who are trying to make it illegal to even teach the actual history of the United States, which is just breathtaking. Earl, thank you for the call. We'll continue with your calls in just a moment. It's 46 minutes past the hour. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Right back with your calls in just a moment. It's your media support group for we the people of the United States of America. And welcome back. MJ in Ankeny, Iowa. Hey, MJ, what's on your mind today? MJ, watching us on Free Speech TV in Iowa? Going once, going twice.
Here you are.
Oh.
Hi, Tom. I'm
Just
here.
in time. Hey,
I'm
MJ,
sorry.
what's up?
I accidentally hit the mute. It's so good to have you back, and thanks for taking my call. I want to first reach out to my state. I moved to Iowa from Colorado, and all my friends out there who might be in Colorado Springs, what happened over the weekend, how terrible it was, and it just breaks my heart because I have a lot of friends who are LGBTQ in Colorado, and I just want to reach out my heart to them, and it was a really hard thing.
Yeah. It's a difficult time for that community, but it's been a difficult time forever for that community, and you know, it is not helped by Republican politicians, you know, with all their groomer and whatnot rhetoric, trying to. And the fact of the matter is, I mean, most pedophiles are straight. You know, just trying to demonize an entire community of people. It's just so wrong.
And what I think came out, at least, you know, sometimes I troll these other like very conservative sites. It was kind of like they were egging it on. Well, you know, they deserve it, or even the whole terrible things they would say about Paul Pelosi after he got attacked.
Yeah.
And I just thought, how can you, if you consider yourself a Christian, that you can talk like this? What is it that you can say that still makes you a Christian when you say that?
Well, there's a missing word when these people call themselves Christians, and that's white. The hardcore right-wing movement associated with Christianity is first and foremost a white supremacy movement, and only secondarily a Christian movement. They do not recognize the Jesus of the Bible. I'm guessing the vast majority of them couldn't even quote Jesus from the Bible.
And they think that Alex Jones is getting wrongfully accused and taken advantage of. I'm like, what? Yeah. You're kidding me. With Sandy Hook, like, you'd think this? Like, how it's all become so just... And I think Mark Twain said it the best. The truth has no defense against a fool determined to believe a lie.
Oh, I haven't heard that quote. That's a great one. I like his, you know, a lie will get halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on. That was always a good one.
But, and then I also was reading something, there was an article from 2016 likening, you know, Donald Trump to David Duke. And I didn't realize David Duke made it so high in politics in Louisiana. I just wasn't aware of that. And I actually lived in Colorado at the time. So it could be we were all, you know, trying to get that state to be a blue state at the time.
Well, you know, the number two guy in Republican leadership right now is Steve Scalise. And Steve Scalise once described himself as David Duke without the baggage.
Oh, my God.
He's from Louisiana. I mean, that's how you get elected in Louisiana. David Duke endorsed Donald Trump, and Trump did not disavow it. Trump was like, cool.
Thank you so much. But, you know, I only see Mike Pence, I don't know if you saw any of his interviews, but I've had people I've talked to, they're like, do you think he's creepy? And I'm like, oh, he is creepy.
He's smarmy.
He's not one of those slimy, creepy. And I've heard somebody say it's almost like a pedophile kind of vibe.
Yeah, he's smarmy. He's unctuous. He's, you know, there's a collection of adjectives there that they're just going to give you the shivers. MJ, I got to run, but thank you for the call. It's nice to hear from you. I appreciate it. Thank you, and thank you for watching us on Free Speech TV. We'll be right back. It's coming up on 10 minutes before the hour. Paul in Woodinville is up next. We'll be right back with you. Hey, I have a new book out. It's called The Hidden History of Neoliberalism, How Reaganism Gutted America and How to Restore Its Greatness. Greg Palast calls it a hand grenade of a book. You can pick it up wherever fine books are available. Tag you're it. If you believe that someone is a billionaire without seeing their taxes, if you believe someone is a genius if they hide their college grades, if you believe someone is a great businessman if they bankrupted casinos, if you believe somebody is an irresistible ladies' man if they have to pay for sex or even accused of rape, if you believe somebody is a philanthropist, if their charity got shut down for fraud and their children had to go through mandatory training about how not to commit fraud with philanthropies, if you believe someone is a patriot, if they got out of the draft during a time of war by submitting phony, dodgy x-rays showing bone spurs, if you believe someone is a Christian, who doesn't go to church and doesn't know what 2 Thessalonians is. If you believe someone is an innocent man if they refuse to testify, well, you're not just gullible, you're a Trump supporter. I have a whole video about this over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. And welcome back. Picking up your phone calls. Paul in Woodinville, Washington. Hey, Paul, what's on your mind today?
Good to have you back, Tom. May I first submit to yourself and the listening audience that on this program and in all circles of progressive parlance, that we from now on refrain from violence metaphors of bringing guns to knives to gunfights or whatever, knives to gunfights and circular firing squads and such other type violent metaphors, and not participate in any of that. For instance, I no longer say killing two birds with one stone. I now say the Jesus version, feeding two birds with one seed. So I think we can be creative.
It's better than crocodiles to a butterfly farm.
Then Tom doesn't have to get mixed up about what kind of fight it is and what he's supposed to bring.
Right, okay.
So, you can make our own, and we're creative enough to do
I make no promises, Paul, but I'll try to keep it in mind.
Okay, well, it's a challenge for the audience. I just, of course, really agree with everything that your guest said at the beginning of the hour, and I would submit that for even the CRT haters be damned, the Constitution was founded on slavery and racism, and it's been a word game ever since the Civil War. And what happens here is when you talk about gerrymandering, so you're right, the Supreme Court punted on partisan gerrymandering and said, we'll let the states decide, which means that the Supreme Court thinks it's not unconstitutional to have partisan gerrymandering. But the racial gerrymandering, there is a constitutional issue because we have the 15th Amendment. And so, whereas if they think that if you punt it back to the states, that one is a way in for the other, in other words, you can do partisan gerrymandering and that ends up being racial gerrymandering, one should preclude the other. In other words, because of the constitutional protections, you can do partisan gerrymandering to the degree and so long as it doesn't become racial gerrymandering.
Right, but that's not what they said, as you well know.
That's right. And so they said, go ahead and do it. And that's what this whole Moore versus Harper case will be about coming up 2 weeks from today, when the North Carolina legislature wants the court to just give it all to them and let them decide, regardless of what the North Carolina Supreme Court says about having to be in line with the 15th Amendment. Now, the 15th Amendment says, Section 2, it's very short, says Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Now, if you ask me, Tom, that is a hands-off judicial review a clause in the Constitution. Doesn't it say that?
Yeah, but it does require action by Congress, and good luck with that.
That's true. It does require that, but the Congress did already pass the Voting Rights Act, which the Supreme Court ought to leave their damn hands off because the 15th Amendment, Section 2, says Congress shall have the power to enforce. But
they've already gutted the Voting Rights Act twice.
That's right, and
they're fixing to do it a third time.
Yeah, and so what I'm saying is, here's what we're up against, is that I always hear the right-wingers say that, the courts are supposed to interpret law, they're not supposed to make law, but that's really never been true, because common law courts, we didn't have legislatures. We had common law courts before we had legislatures, and on a case-by-case basis, the common law courts made law. And to the extent that we now have textualism, laws that statutory textualism, the courts still weigh on. So the law is not just what's written, it's what the courts say about it. But when it comes to overturn, and that's why we have precedent. They're supposed to adhere to precedent, stare decisis. So what they really do is the Supreme Court essentially makes constitutional amendments without having to go through these supermajority hoops that we, the people, have to jump through.
That's correct.
Yeah. Just because some dumb orange bozo was president for 4 years and an illegitimate president and happened to slide on 3 illegitimate justices out of the court, they get to make constitutional amendments by overturning precedent, which is really what they're really doing is these are constitutional amendments. Every time they make a decision, they're saying this is what the Constitution really says.
Yeah, I get your complaint, Paul. We've got about 10 seconds. What's your solution?
Part 2 coming up.
Okay. All right. We'll have to hold our breath for that one. Paul, thanks a lot. It's great to hear from you. It's great to be back. Thank you so much for being with us today. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. In the meantime, don't forget democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires all of us, and that includes you. So get out there, get active, tag, you're it. There's a big election coming up in 2 years. We need to start getting ready right now. A lot going on. So have a great afternoon. Be good to yourself and the people around you, and we will see you tomorrow. You're it.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
Thank you.